be conducting today's public hearing on gun safety proposals and the status of firearm ammunition sales database in New York. The purpose of the hearing is to seek input on legislation to further enhance the safety of New Yorkers by regulating in appropriate ways the importing and availability of firearms in New York and helping to ensure the safe storage and operation of lawfully obtained guns. I am joined here by Assemblymember Tom Abernathy, who also sits on the Codes Committee. We may be joined by other colleagues as we proceed. Now, our Assembly majority has championed legislation and enacted laws designed to help keep New Yorkers safe. Many significant measures have been enacted, including the SAFE Act, which places limits on who can possess firearms. The SAFE Act, plus limits on who can possess firearms on school grounds, prohibitions on certain rapid-fire devices, gun buyback programs, safe storage requirements for firearms, legislation making extreme risk protection orders available in court, a 30-day waiting period for certain firearm purchases, and legislation affirming liability for certain manufacturers and distributors of illegally possessed firearms. During this hearing, the Codes Committee will be taking testimony and questioning stakeholders about ways in which we can further curb gun-related accidents, unlawful gun use in New York, as well as reduce the proliferation of illegal guns in our state. Additionally, under the SAFE Act enacted in 2013, a database was to be launched and utilized in New York for record-keeping and background checks on ammunition purchases. In 2015, a memorandum of understanding was reached between Governor Cuomo's chief aide and then Senate Majority Leader Flanagan, suspending the development of the firearm ammunition sales database called for in the SAFE Act. The committee is again today following up on the status of this needed ammunition purchase database, and I should point out this memorandum of understanding was between the governor's aide and the leader of one of the houses. The following agencies were asked to testify today about the status of the ammunition purchase database, but declined to testify. And I should point out that we're in a time when, if you see what's happening in Congress, there are people who are being asked to testify regarding the attempted coup that took place on January 6th. And there, some people are avoiding being subpoenaed or certainly not complying with the subpoena. In our case, we intend to press officials of these agencies on the reasons for the continued delay in establishing the ammunition database, and we could very well resume this hearing at a later date this year, and we will consider subpoenas if necessary. Those agencies include the Division of Criminal Justice Services, the New York State Police, the Office of Information and Technology Services, and the Office of Prevention of Domestic Violence. And I am hopeful that those agencies will do the right thing, especially since we're in a new political era with a governor who is committed to openness and transparency, and perhaps those agencies didn't get the memo on that yet. Participants in today's hearing will limit their testimony to 5 minutes in duration to ensure that we hear from all of our invited witnesses. I would like, and some people or groups will be submitting testimony to the committee in writing. I want to thank everybody in advance. I know this will be an informative and productive discussion. We will accept the written testimony by October 28th. Now, everybody in this room must be masked at all times. The only people who don't have to be masked is an assembly member who is asking a question or an assembly member who is making a comment, or if you're a witness testifying, you may pull your mask down. No exceptions. Anybody not following this rule will be escorted out by the sergeant. With that, let's start with the first witness, and I want to keep in mind, I know some people have schedules here to keep, and we're going to make sure that everybody is able to do that. Where's the list of witnesses? Is that list of witnesses? I probably have it somewhere. The list of witnesses. Oh, thank you. I see we have been joined by, turn around please. Is that Latrice?
Yes, it is.
It's Assembly Member Latrice Walker, all the way from Brooklyn.
Yes.
Welcome. Thank you for being
By
here.
way of Hudson. We had the Women's Caucus today.
So the first witness is that Rebecca?
That's me.
That's you. Is Rebecca Fisher, the Executive Director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence.
Thank you, Chair Dinowitz and members of the Assembly Codes Committee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Rebecca Fisher, and I'm the Executive Director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. New Yorkers Against Gun Violence is a statewide organization that for the past 25 years has been advocating for strong, sensible gun violence policies and measures at the state, federal, and local levels. Despite New York's relatively strong gun safety laws, gun violence is a growing public health epidemic in New York that's been made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has led to a rise in gun sales and illegal gun trafficking, including the sale of untraceable ghost guns. COVID-19 has also caused unemployment and poverty to surge and has deepened other systemic inequities in the poorest sections of our cities. These factors, combined with easy access to guns, has caused a spike in gun violence that has disproportionately impacted Black and brown New Yorkers. Statewide in 2020, there was a 75% increase in shootings and an 82% increase in gun homicides, impacting all of our cities, including Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Troy and Albany, down to New York City. And tragically, the rates have continued to rise in 2021. We cannot allow this violence to continue. Federal gun reforms continue to languish before the U.S. Congress as Americans die every single day in this country. So New York must continue to lead. We need comprehensive solutions to tackle this complex epidemic. No one law, policy, or program is going to end this crisis. New York must implement gun and ammunition regulations, but also expand funding for strategies that support Black and brown New Yorkers most impacted by gun violence. And as I make this point, I would be remiss if I did not point out that there is a noticeable absence at this hearing of Black and brown gun violence prevention advocates, survivors, and community leaders doing the daily work on the ground. I urge this committee to do more outreach to Black-led organizations working to reduce shootings. I was asked to focus my testimony on the New York Safe Act's ammunition database requirement that would provide for background checks on every ammunition sale. And second, I will discuss another ammunition-related solution, microstamping technology. In 2013, in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, New York State enacted the New York Safe Act, a comprehensive package of sensible gun safety laws. At that time, New York recognized that regulating ammunition was and is in the best interest of the public safety. Background checks on firearms work. Background checks on ammunition work. They prevent individuals with a history of violence from accessing guns and bullets. In California, state law requires background checks on ammunition sales. Over a 6-month period, background checks stopped more than 750 people from buying bullets illegally. 73% of Americans support laws regulating ammunition sales. That's why New York lawmakers, as a part of the SAFE Act, required retail sellers to run background checks on the sale of ammunition. 8 years later, however, that certification process has still not yet been initiated. In 2019, the former governor reported that the state police at ITS were working with at least 30 staff members to create the database. This is encouraging, and I expected that the state police would be here today, although it seems like they may not be. I hope that they submit testimony so that we can hear about new developments. It is long past time for New York State to finally implement this life-saving law. Second, New York State should enact microstamping legislation. This legislation would require that all new semi-automatic pistols sold or delivered in the state of New York be equipped with microstamping technology. A microstamped firearm has a unique code engraved in the gun's firing pin. This code is then stamped into each cartridge case when the gun is fired. This allows police to trace cartridge cases found at crime scenes back to the firearms, back to the dealers, and back to the manufacturers. The microstamped code is similar to a car's license plate. Microstamping technology can help to address the cycles of unsolved gun crimes, violence, and the flow of illegal guns trafficked into impacted communities. It is commercially available and can be mass produced for a cost between 50 cents and $5 per firearm. Over the long run, this bill can help address the crisis of gun trafficking, unsolved shootings, and can save lives across the state of New York. New York has made significant progress and is a model state for the rest of the country on gun violence prevention. But with daily shootings surging and death tolls rising all over the state, we are facing a serious public health emergency, and it must be treated as one. I am asking this committee and the entire state legislature and governor to make more progress, to make more action, and to reduce gun violence in all of our communities. Thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I just have a few questions, and then I'll give my colleagues an opportunity. So in New York, in crimes committed with guns, would you say most of the guns are purchased legally or illegally?
Of crime guns. So
crime guns.
About 70% of the crime guns that are recovered in New York State originate out of state from weak gun law states, but 30% of illegal guns that are recovered are from this state. Interstate.
And of the guns, I imagine some guns committed in crimes were actually legal guns, although not used legally. Would you say that the majority of the guns that are used in crimes are illegal guns?
They are legally purchased, correct.
Do you have any data relating to the trends, to these trends, that, specific data that you might be able to share either now or later on? I'd be curious I love looking at numbers, and it's obviously a huge concern. People talk about the guns coming from states like Virginia, which to me points out the need for passing legislation on a national level, of course, but we have trouble sometimes getting laws passed in New York, but in other states, it's like, it's a third rail for some of the elected officials to even deal with.
Well, that's absolutely true. And as I said, over 70% of the crime guns that are recovered in New York State originate from out of state. They are trafficked up the iron pipeline, including Virginia, and also from Ohio. 30% of the illegal guns that are recovered in the state, which still cause violence and lead to tragedies, are trafficked within the state and originate here. That being said, I understand your concerns that we need federal reforms, which we do, but that does not preclude us from doing more work here in New York, which is why last session we actually enacted a law that would allow New Yorkers now and the New York State Attorney General to sue gun manufacturing companies that recklessly lead to flowing guns into our most vulnerable communities. But we need to continue to strengthen our state laws in the meantime. As I said during my testimony, we cannot rely on one law, one policy, or one program. We need comprehensive solutions. The microstamping legislation that I suggested is one that I would recommend. I would also recommend expanding more funding for community violence intervention programs. We need to implement strategies that support communities and do not penalize them.
Right. I believe that in this year's budget, the Assembly allocated a very significant amount of money to deal with gun violence, particularly in the areas hardest hit, such as some areas of Brooklyn and the Bronx, among others, of course. One of the things that I'm most concerned about is gun violence in schools and among young people. What do you think we should be doing that we're not doing, in addition to, as you mentioned, intervention programs?
Well, I actually would strongly recommend that we allocate more funding for education in schools that not only teaches about guns and gun violence, but also provides facilitated conversation and support for those who are impacted most by gun violence. Internal school shootings, mass shootings inside of New York State's public schools or private schools is not an enormous issue in New York State. What we are dealing with, however, are individuals who are pushed out of the school system, who end up in the criminal justice system, and do not have enough support from their school or their community to be able to thrive. And so I think that schools can be doing more to actually provide education and counseling and support so that we do not lead to the school, to gun violence, to prison pipeline.
I know that in my district has parts of 3 police precincts, and one of them it covers a piece of my district, the 47th precinct in the Northeast Bronx, and we are constantly reading about shootings that are taking place in that precinct, and to me it's shocking. I mean, the numbers of people being shot really since the advent of COVID is horrendous. I mean, I'm hoping that those numbers go down, especially as the virus subsides. Hopefully it'll subside if everybody gets vaccinated.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think that that's absolutely important to point out that with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were a number of different factors that immediately impacted the communities that are most impacted by gun violence. Like I said, poverty and unemployment, the lack of safe spaces indoors, schools closing, and particularly during the summer months, just really nowhere to go. And when young people feel powerless and do not have resources, do not have access to health care, do not have access to employment, and there are guns being pouring into their communities, and if they feel marginalized, there is a likelihood that they may pick up a gun. And that is why we're seeing 16-year-olds dying in front of playgrounds across the state. And the only way to really come out of this is, of course, we can only hope that our economy will improve and that guns will stop being trafficked into those neighborhoods. But in the meantime, we need to provide evidence-based support for those young people, for communities that have been disenfranchised. And that is really the issue here. Higher penalties, imprisonment, incarceration, that will only lead to further cycles of mass incarceration, and we strongly oppose those measures and strongly encourage more support and more investment in Black and brown communities.
Okay. I could ask you more questions, but number one, I want to keep people's schedules in mind, and number two, I want to give my colleagues an opportunity. Assemblymember Abernathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for conducting this hearing. Thank you for joining us today. Let me start off. I agree with you that we are in a crisis right now as a result of gun violence, and that we need a comprehensive approach to deal with all aspects of it. I saw an article not long ago about illegal guns that come from theft. The article said that thieves steal a gun about every 2 minutes in the United States. That's a lot of illegal guns that started off as legal that are now illegal. In our state, do you think it's possible that we could enhance the requirement for safe storage? I know in Westchester County I passed some legislation that required everyone to safely store every gun. I don't think we're there yet in New York. Am I correct?
We are not there yet. We have a strong safe storage law that was passed as a part of the New York SAFE Act that requires individual gun owners to lock up their guns when a prohibited individual lives in the home. And most recently, New York passed a law requiring gun owners and individuals who have children in the home to lock up their guns as well. I think that it would be a smart and efficient policy move to require more broadly safe storage. I think we have to be careful with the penalties in any safe storage legislation that we move forward with, but it is definitely something worth considering.
I'm also concerned about the misuse of guns by people who should not have these guns. I would like to see a mental health evaluation before any gun purchase can be approved. What would your reaction to that be?
We need to be very careful not to stigmatize the mentally, that anyone who's been diagnosed with a mental health disorder, okay? So while it is important to evaluate whether or not purchasers have been in crisis, whether they have a history of violence, and whether or not they have a severe mental illness that shows that they have a tendency towards violent behavior, In general, doing a mental health evaluation may end up stigmatizing the mental health community while not necessarily going specifically for violent behavior. And that's why, for example, New York passed the extreme risk protection order law, which specifically allows family members, members of the household, law enforcement to request an order from the court to remove guns from individuals who've been shown to be in crisis. And that may mean that an affidavit is submitted by a mental health professional showing that they have severe behavior or that they may have exhibited suicidal ideation. But in general, clinical depression is not an indicator of violence. And so we have to be careful about
Well, doesn't that go to how you draft the legislation, not whether you should have it?
Well, I think the question that was asked, and I understand, is whether or not we should draft legislation that includes a mental health evaluation.
Right.
And in general, I don't think that generally evaluating any purchaser for a mental health disorder and whether or not that, whatever the conclusion might be, should be an indicator of whether or not the individual should be prohibited. I think there should be a requirement for evaluating whether there's been violent behavior, and that's that's the question to look at, not necessarily a mental health disorder.
What about for suicide prevention? Don't we have to deal with that as well? Guns are used quite a bit for suicides.
I agree, and I think that when it comes to suicide, we know that when an individual attempts suicide with a gun, they are 90% likely to actually successfully complete that suicide.
But isn't that where a mental health evaluation might be handy?
A mental health evaluation would be helpful in that situation, but generally I would say it should be an evaluation for whether or not that individual has exhibited violent behavior or has exhibited suicidal ideation and is a risk to themselves or others. I don't know that I would necessarily generally categorize it as a mental health evaluation.
Okay, but again, it goes to how you draft the legislation, not the concept.
Well,
okay.
Exactly. I think.
I'm going to stop in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, Assemblymember Walker.
Hello. Okay. So thank you so much for your testimony as well as your impeccable work in this area. One of the recommendations that you've made was about an investment in Black and brown communities where we have some of the highest incidences. And in my district just this year, in the 73rd precinct, we have had 70 shooting victims and 58 incidences of shootings. In the 75th precinct, we've had 71 shootings and 57 shooting incidences just this year. There were, a couple of years ago, there was a shooting that took place in Brownsville, which a number of people were shot in one incident. And we wanted to get a classification of a mass shooting for this particular incident. But we were told that based on the dynamics of it being street violence, gang violence, that it didn't necessarily qualify for the definition of a mass shooting. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that that's wrong. I think that any shooting where there's multiple individuals who have been injured or shot constitutes a mass shooting, and we're just talking about semantics that may have been coined by the media or by other government officials. When Black and brown human beings are shot and killed, there should be the same level of action and response from everyone in this country. And that was a mass shooting. I remember that, Assemblymember Walker. We had a rally at Grand Army after that happened, and I believe you or some of your colleagues were there. And it is a problem that the daily gun violence that's affecting Black and brown New Yorkers and Americans across the country, it does not receive the same attention, that the victims are criminalized, and that it's seen as something different than what we see in the suburbs of Florida or in our schools or at concerts. It's not. This is a public health epidemic that is affecting everyone, but is disproportionately impacting Black and brown New Yorkers and Black and brown Americans. And until we truly invest and do more research and treat this as a public health epidemic that will actually support and allow disenfranchised Black and brown communities to thrive, we're going to continue to have a problem.
Well, I also, I am of the belief that even when you have 70 shooting victims in 1 year in one precinct and one community, that should also be raised to the level of a response for a mass shooting. What are some of the things that takes place from a community perspective, government perspective, organizational perspective with respect to mass shootings? Like, how are they generally tended to be handled?
What is the response that typically occurs?
Yes, you were saying that the actions, it deserves the same type of action.
I mean, when there is a mass shooting, it gets national media attention. And when I say a mass shooting, again, I'm using a label that has been coined by others, not by my organization. And that typically, let's be honest, Americans have been desensitized to what a mass shooting is. So when we hear that there's been 7 children shot in a school and only 1 died, only 1, even then, we're not really considering it a mass shooting worthy of our response. So unless there are now hundreds of individuals shot down, at a concert outdoors in Las Vegas, Americans turn the other way. And that is deeply, deeply problematic. We have a problem in Washington that even now, we can't seem to move any federal legislation through the Senate, which is why we need to come back to New York and think about what we can be doing in New York to lead as a model. And I think that the more that New York looks at this holistically and begins to understand that, yes, because 70% of crime guns are trafficked from weak gun law states that, by the way, don't have background checks on firearms, don't have background checks on ammunition, don't have microstamping, don't have safe storage. You can buy a gun in the back of a parking lot from private seller to private seller, no problem, and no background check, not a crime. That's where the guns are frequently coming from. So anyone that says that strong gun laws don't work is not understanding that that those guns are coming from those weak gun law states, right? That being said, we need to understand that as those guns continue to come here, there's more that we can do here to support the communities that they're being poured into. And so that's why we need community violence intervention programs. We need hospital violence intervention programs. We need education in schools. We need programs that are credibly led by Black and brown individuals and leaders who are from the community, that know the community, that have credibility and understand because they have been there, which is one of the reasons why it was so important to me as a part of my testimony to point out that when we're talking about gun violence prevention solutions, we must include the individuals who are most impacted. And they should be here.
Well, I do commend you for that because we just had another iteration of the Brownsville Safety Alliance, which was the brainchild of Inspector Terrell Anderson at the 73rd Precinct and a number of groups. And everyone just sort of comes out. We've seen the incidences be lowered based on that response. And then Brookdale Hospital also has a shooting response that they do with elite learners, which is one of the groups that are in our community. So one of the things, too, you mentioned some national attention with respect to legislation. But just recently, we're hearing a lot about Facebook and bullying and cracking down on that. But we're noticing also that a number of gun sales are being facilitated via Facebook, Instagram, as well as a number of shooting situations being sparked by Facebook beef and so what are your thoughts on some of the things that we may be able to do to sort of crack down with respect to the pipeline of guns utilizing mechanisms such as social media?
I think that is a really important point, and one that's worth looking into further from a policy perspective. In New York State, a background check must be run on any gun sale, including online, but that is not the case on a national level and is not the case in many other states. And as we see the increase in also untraceable, unserialized ghost guns, that enhances the issue in terms of tracing. So what do we do with that? I mean, we need to put more pressure on corporations that facilitate these online sales or allow for postings like Facebook or other social media platforms, I can tell you that there are smart, socially responsible corporations like PayPal, for example, that do not allow their platform to be used in any way when a gun sale goes through. There needs to be a background check. And I think that there needs to be further regulations of online sales in general, and I think that's worth looking into from a policy perspective, perhaps something you can carry and draft.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it. Oh, I see we've been joined by Assemblyman Tanusis. Seeing no other questions, we have a witness who's going to be on some screen, right? Are they here? Are we ready? Okay, thank you very much. You could stay, since you're part of the
In
panel
theory, I
with
have
them.
a panel. They're just
Yeah, that's a
invisible.
theory. So the next two witnesses together, and then we're going to take the police panel, include Diane Ronaldo, volunteer leader, Moms Demand Action, New York chapter, and T. Christian Hain, Vice President, Brady United Against Gun Violence.
Would you like me to start?
Sure.
Okay.
Wait, aren't they supposed to be on that screen? Yes, start. We can hear you.
Okay, here.
Just keep in mind our time constraints.
Yep.
Thank you for being here.
I'm a volunteer with Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, the nation's largest grassroots organization working to end gun violence. We advocate for gun safety legislation and community violence prevention, taking a research and evidence-based approach. Thank you for inviting our organization to testify today and accommodating me to do so remotely. As you know, New York has led the country in the fight against gun violence for many years, from the SAFE Act through bills that were passed earlier this year, including a bill passed this year to regulate ghost guns, a growing threat across the country, which we urge Governor Hochul to sign soon. Unfortunately, there's no one policy or program that will end gun violence, and we still have work to do. In New York, on average, 3,400 people are shot and killed or wounded every year. And of course, we have seen an increase in shootings since the pandemic began. Gun violence in the U.S. reflects and, in fact, intensifies this country's long-standing racial inequities. Tragically, Black people in New York are 15 times more likely to die by gun homicide than white people. Additionally, gun violence costs New York $5.9 billion each year, of which $321 million is paid by taxpayers. We know we have strong allies in the New York legislature, and we look forward to working together to do more, including continued violence intervention funding. New York made a great first step in this year's budget, allocating 10% of VOCA, that's Victims of Crime Act, budget to community-led safety initiatives like street outreach and hospital-based intervention programs. These programs are evidence-based, led by credible messengers, and have been shown to have real impact on neighborhoods that are disproportionately impacted by gun violence. Additionally, they provide opportunities educationally and economically that give people in these communities hope for a better future. New York should continue its commitment to investing in these programs, taking advantage of federal dollars like the American Rescue Plan Act and more. The state should also find innovative ways to support these programs in accessing available funds and scaling their reach. We also hope to work with the state to remove some of the barriers which gun violence survivors face in accessing victim compensation funds. Microstamping, Rebecca spoke a bit about this. You know, we agree that this
Your
is,
sound is fading.
we agree, can you hear me now?
No.
This new technology will make it easier to solve firearm homicides and assaults and combat the illegal gun trafficking that supplies the market of illegal guns commonly used to commit violent crimes. Can you hear me now?
It's a little difficult to hear you.
I have no idea why I didn't change anything, but I'll get a little closer. Police reform. We also must reaffirm that police violence is gun violence, and in order to keep our communities safe, reforms are needed. For instance, from 2013 through 2020, Black people were over 5 times as likely as white people to be killed by police in New York. The data also shows that in the same time, 98% of all killings by police nationally did not result in an officer even being charged. Moms Demand Action stands with other advocates calling for an end to qualified immunity in New York, which shields bad actors in law enforcement from accountability. We have also been heartened by local pilot programs to promote alternative dispatch to ensure that people in crisis are receiving the help they need, and we hope to explore how to scale this model further. We look forward to continuing our work with the legislature, with advocates and activists across New York, and community-based violence intervention programs to further strengthen our laws, to empower those community-based programs, and to reform law enforcement. Thank you for having us here today.
Thank you.
And would you like me to start?
Yeah, how do you, you have to switch to the next person, Mr. Hain.
Great. Can you all hear me?
There you are. Good morning.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Chairman Dinowitz and the esteemed members of this committee. My name is Christian Heine.
The sound problem is at our end. Do our technical people know how to fix that?
I can try to speak up as well, if that's helpful.
We could go on to the next panel while we're waiting. I don't want to waste time. Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Well, let's see if you speak loudly, if we can hear you better.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
You want to try to start and just speak as loudly as you can, as close to the microphone as you can?
Absolutely.
You
Absolutely.
have to wait a little while.
Absolutely. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Let's see. Okay, let's try. Okay, you want to try again?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, just barely. I don't think it would do justice.
He should just start.
Yeah? Okay, why don't you start then?
Okay. Well, I'll jump in and I'll jump in. I'm a pretty loud guy, so hopefully that'll be helpful here.
Okay, yeah,
Usually
we
it's
like New Yorkers, we like loud.
Yeah. Usually I get in trouble for it, so I'll try to do my best to go against that learning.
Okay, so let's get started.
All right. Well, thank you, Chairman Dinowitz and esteemed members of this committee. My name is Christian Heine. I'm the Vice President of Policy here at Brady. I come to this movement and this work as a survivor of gun violence, like so many others that come to this work. In 2005, my parents were just coming back from a holiday vacation. They were coming to return a boat that they had used for Memorial Day. They spent the weekend getting sunburnt, eating barbecue, having a vacation for the record books. And when they came back to return that boat to my dad's best friend, a man lay in wait to kill my dad's best friend. Because my parents were there, he turned the gun on them and shot them as well. My father survived. We're very lucky. My father survived being shot multiple times, but my mom was shot and killed. A single bullet to the back took her life, and the last words that she'll ever speak on this earth were begging for her life. My story is horrible. It has altered my entire life path, but it isn't unique. Just like so many of comments that have been made in this hearing already, the only remarkable part of my story is how unremarkable it is. 2020 was a horrific year in the tale of this country, and I think in the overall arc of gun violence in this country. 2020 was the deadliest year that we have witnessed in decades. It was the highest one-year increase in homicides, in fact, that we have witnessed in this country since we began keeping records. And we know that the country's largest cities often primarily populated in Black and brown communities most vulnerable to gun violence, suffered a 30% spike across the country. New York City alone, the number of shooting victims more than doubled in 2020. And the one thing we don't talk often enough about is that injuries also increased in that period of time. For every gun death that we see, there are 2 to 3 times as many people who are injured by gun violence and have to go on with the trauma and the pain and the health issues that come along with those injuries. The one thing I will say and just congratulate and thank this body for in particular is the work that you have done to combat gun violence and to assure you that the work that you do in New York has a ripple effect that goes beyond New York to the rest of the country, in particularly trickles up and down along the Iron Pipeline, which has been mentioned earlier by Rebecca and others as a primary reason for why guns flow into New York, regardless of the fact that New York has the strong gun laws that you have. That being said, this legislative session was an incredible year and step forward for New York. And there's more that can be done. And there's more that you all are considering right now that has the potential to do even greater good in combating gun violence. We've talked a lot today about demand side solutions, the importance of funding in order to address root causes. Those kinds of investments break cycles of gun violence and should continue, should increase. And New York in particular has some of the best gun violence intervention programs in the country. That is really critical work that is a public health approach that's having a huge difference. What I want to talk to you more about today is the important complement to that, which is the supply side approach to gun violence. And this also has been discussed quite a bit today. The question that we often ask ourselves is, why is it that communities are overrun with guns? And the true fact of the matter is because so many of our solutions are oriented towards identifying who it is that pulled the trigger of the firearm. What we don't ask enough is, where did the gun come from? It doesn't have to be a fact that in communities like it is right now, that people have to live in a space, in a place where it is easier to buy a gun than it is to find fresh produce. We need to start tackling that question of, where did these guns come from? Because they don't grow on trees. Guns are manufactured by licensed manufacturers. They are sold by licensed dealers. And at some point between when the gun is legally sold and when it is used in a crime, there is a diversion to the criminal market. But what do we also know? We know that somewhere around 5% of gun dealers, only 5% of gun dealers are responsible for somewhere around 90% of crime guns. It is a really small minority of irresponsible gun dealers that are responsible for the proliferation of guns that we are finding in our communities that is driving that violence. And we need to start taking an approach that asks the question where these guns came from and that adequately holds the gun industry accountable for irresponsible and negligent actors. New York has started this process already. Just this last session, Senator Myrie and Assemblymember Fahey's gun industry accountability bill will ensure that these irresponsible and negligent actors can be held accountable through civil liability. This legislative body also just dealt with ghost guns, as mentioned earlier. Ghost guns are an industry, an entire industry designed to circumvent and undermine all existing federal and state gun laws. And just last week, Governor Hochul joined other neighboring states to share information that will allow law enforcement to more effectively identify how guns are flowing into New York communities. All these are important steps in that supply side approach. But as we look to the future, there's more that can be done. We're talking about the regulation of ammunition. I know that's the point of this hearing today. That's a critical step forward to make sure that the people who are acquiring ammunition are individuals who simply aren't prohibited from purchasing and possessing weapons in and of itself. There's also legislation that's sitting before the body right now. Legislation like Assemblymember Paulin's A837, a bill that requires that gun dealers do more to prevent theft and straw purchasing, because we know that too often the communities, Black and brown communities that are disproportionately impacted by gun violence, are impacted by gun violence from guns that are purchased, bought and sold outside of those communities. And so we need to do a better job of making sure that we're requiring gun dealers to play a more effective role, just like a vast majority of them already do voluntarily, to ensure that theft and straw purchasing is not taking place through their business. And we can do those things. There's another
Mr.
bill.
Hain, you have to wrap up since you've gone
Wrap
way over
up.
your time.
Well, the other two bills I'll just mention at the top end here is that there's a bill that would make New York a point of contact state. That is A930, also being introduced by Assemblymember Paulin. And I also give my full-throated endorsement of the microstamping bill that will revolutionize ballistic forensics for the state of New York and for the country. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. I have one quick question for either of the two of you. I don't know if either of the two of you can get on. What's been the experience in New York up until now with extreme risk protection orders?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that extreme risk protection orders in particular are something that we should constantly be looking at. I know that since that law has been put into place, we still need some time to understand how it is being implemented. I can tell you from a national scale, around the same time that New York began implementing that tool, that we have seen a vast majority of extreme risk laws and extreme risk orders issued by law enforcement. We have seen primarily that the individuals that have been able to, who have been subject to those extreme risk orders, are individuals who are at a heightened risk of suicidal ideation and suicidal behavior, those behavioral risk factors. So in large part, we're seeing it used against a demographic of older white men who are more susceptible to suicide overall. And that the studies that we've seen out of states like California indicate that they are also playing a role in preventing, in certain anecdotes, mass shootings. But in large part, they're being used to prevent suicide.
Thank you. Latrice, do you have any? Mike? Okay, thank you both very much. Thank you all three, I should say, very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Okay, our next panel includes New York City Police Commissioner Dermot Shea, Assistant Deputy Commissioner Oleg Sherenyaski, John Mueller, who is the Yonkers Police Commissioner, and Patrick Phelan, Executive Director, New York Association of Chiefs of Police. Thank you all for being here. I'm sensitive to your schedule. Why don't we start with Commissioner Shea, who I should point out used to be our captain in the 50th Precinct in the Northwest Bronx.
A long time ago.
Was it that long?
Yes, it was. Good morning, Chair Dinowitz and members of the Assembly. I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify before you today on the growing epidemic of gun violence in our state and my city. I have submitted written testimony that expands on my points today. I will use our time today to speak about three laws: bail, discovery, and raise the age, that must be amended immediately to restore safety across the state while maintaining a level of fairness that was absent from our criminal justice system. I support the need for reforming these laws, but certain provisions in the new laws have skewed the system in favor of those arrested for violent crimes and recidivist criminals at the expense of crime victims and the general public. Turning to bail reform, I believe that the state legislature should eliminate cash bail altogether. Instead, I believe that the legislature should amend the law so that a judge may either release a person with or without conditions or remand that person because they pose a threat to the public. The existence of cash bail allows fundamental inequities to remain. At the same time, new requirements that judges impose, quote, the least restrictive, end quote, means of ensuring a person returns to court, and new requirements that force judges to consider the individual's ability to pay has caused individuals who are a threat to the public to be released and to unfortunately victimize more New Yorkers. Last year, 88% of those arrested with a gun were back out on the street within hours or sometimes days of the arrest. This year, that number stands at 82%. Last year, 50% of those arrested for shooting a gun were released within hours or sometimes days of arrest. This year, that number stands at 57%. Before the bail law passed, we typically saw bail set in approximately 65% of gun arrest cases. and at significantly higher amounts of bail. Last year, it was 46%. This year, it is 51%, but with lower amounts. Last year, 9% of gun arrests who were ROR'd, released on their own recognizance, had a prior gun arrest within the previous 3 years, versus 4% in 2019. These releasees averaged 3 prior felonies versus 2 in 2019. Last year, 5% of people arrested with an open gun case were subsequently involved in a shooting or shootings, as compared to 3% in 2019 and 1% in 2018. These numbers represent real people whose lives have been snuffed out or turned upside down in the wake of the gun violence epidemic that we're seeing. Looking at a 6-month rearrest rate, we've rearrested 97 individuals for gun crimes who were released on their own recognizance or out on bail for a gun arrest this year. 89 in 2020, and then the numbers plummet, 48 in 2019, 32 in 2018. Homicides committed by perpetrators with open gun arrests are, of course, also way up. 15 this year, 9 last year, and 6 in 2019. The only way to correct this issue is to amend the law to permit judges to consider the level of danger that an arrestee poses to the public. New York State is the only state in the nation that does not permit its judges to consider some form of dangerousness or public safety when deciding whether to remand or release defendants. Turning to raise the age, there are 2 issues impacting public safety that have emerged over the 3 years since the law has been in effect. First, the Family Court Act was never updated to allow youth part judges access to a juvenile's family court record when deciding whether to remove a felony case to the family court. The result is that juveniles accused of multiple felony crimes appear as perpetual first offenders before that judge, which results in cases consistently being removed to family court. Second, youth part judges were not granted the ability to remove a case to family court based on a public safety risk. The legislature must amend the law so that judges have complete and accurate information when making decisions and more discretion when doing so. This year in New York City, there are approximately 500 juveniles, most of whom are 16 or 17 years young, who have had 4 or more prior arrests. Combined, these individuals are responsible for approximately 3,500 felony crimes. Approximately 176 juveniles have 10 or more arrests. 34 have 20 or more arrests. In the most egregious case, a 17-year-old boy had 83 arrests, 73 of which are felonies. We've seen recently a 50% increase in juvenile gun arrests this year. Of the 356 kids arrested for an illegal gun, 103 have a prior gun arrest. 26 of these kids have 2 prior gun arrests. And in 5 cases, the juvenile had 3 prior gun arrests. And tragically, 2 of these kids are no longer with us. While discovery reform was necessary, the resulting legislation is so onerous that it threatens to break rather than reform the criminal justice system. COVID-related suspension of speedy trial laws has masked and delayed the calamity from occurring, but we expect a significant amount of cases to begin being dismissed starting next month. There are 4 main issues at play here that when combined will topple the criminal justice system, I believe. First, the new law requires the identities of victims and witnesses in almost all cases to be turned over to a defendant within 3 to 5 weeks after arraignment, unless a prosecutor obtains a protective order for such information. Our detectives have now had a significant number of cases that cannot be solved because of an unwillingness on the part of witnesses to cooperate due simply to fear of reprisal and their own safety and their family's safety. There should be a staggered discovery process where defendants would receive the most important and relevant information within 35 days of arraignment, with the rest, including victims and witnesses, identifying information provided at reasonable intervals before trial. Further protection should be afforded witnesses by automatically sealing protective orders. Second, the new discovery laws require production of all material that is, quote, related, end quote, to the criminal case, regardless of whether it is relevant or material. The related standard is so broad that the failure to produce insignificant and duplicative information can result in dismissal of a serious case based on technical grounds. The department has thus far dedicated over 475 members of the department, uniform and civilian, and significant sums on technological expenditures to ensure compliance, and even that may not be enough to avert this crisis. Interacted with no one regarding details on an officer that interacted with no one and subsequently left the scene. For example, a recent shooting in Times Square drew a response from approximately 79 officers to the scene. All but a handful had no information about the incident or the investigation, yet the department had to spend significant resources to track down every single one who ran to the scene. Third, prosecutors cannot certify that they are, quote, ready for trial, end quote, unless all related paperwork has been provided to the defendant. If prosecutors certify ready for trial and a duplicative and irrelevant document is discovered 6 months and 2 days after arraignment, the case gets dismissed. The prosecution must be allowed to answer ready when the prosecution has substantially and materially complied with discovery requirements. When related information is immaterial and all efforts were made in good faith to find it, cases should not be dismissed, and more importantly, victims should not be punished by not seeing their attacker brought to justice. Finally, and thank you for your patience, plea bargains are no longer permissible under the new law unless the defendant waives discovery or discovery has been completed. This new requirement necessitates a significant expenditure of resources by local governments to produce volumes of paperwork for cases that will not go to trial and are not necessary to make an informed decision. As currently written, the impact of the discovery reforms cannot be understated. If left unchanged, the discovery laws will not reform the system for the better, they'll break it. This is not conjecture. For the past year, pre-pandemic felony defendants have requested their case be dismissed on speedy trial grounds by claiming the prosecutor didn't provide each and every piece of paper that exists, even when good faith efforts are made to track it down and the document is not even relevant. These challenges have often proven successful, and the case is unfortunately dismissed. I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I look forward to working with you as partners to address the issues we discussed today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have when we're done.
Okay, I think I'm told you have to leave to go to the airport. Am I right?
I do, but this is important, so I'd
No,
rather stay for this.
Okay, because I was going to ask you the questions, but we can hear from all four of you, and then we can do the questions if that works. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is John Mueller. I'm the Yonkers Police Commissioner. I really appreciate being here today and being given the opportunity to speak to everyone about this issue that really is near and dear to my heart, and I think everybody in New York State's heart, about keeping violence low. I'm going to speak about two issues. One is bail reform, and the other one is raise the age. In Yonkers, we believe that raise the age is really severely impacting gun violence that's being driven by almost exclusively 16 to 17-year-old offenders. As Commissioner Shea said, we think there's a relatively very minor modification to the law that does not affect the spirit of raise the age, and we understand what the reasons were for it. And the truth is, largely, we in law enforcement support those changes in raise the age. At the time when we did change raise the age, I think we were only, two or three states in the union that did not have an older age for adult level offenders. So obviously there's an understanding there, a clear understanding that there was a need for this. But like every law, it can't exist in a vacuum. And every law has to be modified when you have time to take a look at it and there's enough time to evaluate. And I think raise the age, there's time now and there's enough data for us to really take a hard look and see what kind of minor changes we can make with respect to this law to keep the spirit of raise the age, at the same time keeping our communities as safe as we can, because that's really the goal of all police departments. We want to keep our communities as safe as possible, at the same time having them be as secure as they can possibly be with respect to how we're policing. So with respect to raise the age, we've had 10 gang violence shooting in Yonkers in 2021 so far, which is relatively low for a city of our size. Still, one isn't acceptable. And until we get it down to zero, we're not going to be satisfied, we're not going to be happy. What we're seeing is, of those 10 gang-driven shootings, 8 out of the 10 are either 16 or 17-year-olds that have already been arrested or suspected of being the shooter in these cases. And the issue there is that I believe is what Commissioner Shea referred to as what I recall the perennial first offender. Raise the age law was implemented, the Family Court Act was not modified. So essentially, if we just lay this out, a judge sees a youth between 16 and 17, an adolescent offender before court, and the only case he's really able to look at is the case before him, the one gun charge. So he doesn't have the opportunity to review the timeline and the timeline of events that lead up to that gun charge. So we're seeing youth that have 3 and 4 and 5 gun charges, and then when they continue to go back to family court because the judge only sees the case before him. That record gets sealed, and this can be a constantly, repeating situation. I'll give you one example of how this progression gets very dangerous. We have an 18-year-old suspected shooter in a gang-related Yonkers homicide this year. And although he's 18, he was arrested several times as a 16 and 17-year-old. He had been arrested with a loaded firearm in 2019, arrested again with a loaded firearm in 2020, arrested for gang assault in 2021, and indicted for attempted murder in 2021 in an unrelated shooting outside of our jurisdiction. So what you're seeing is this progression. And I think what people need to understand is we can't wring our hands and say, how did this happen? We know exactly how it happened. Because the entire time this adolescent offender was out during the family court proceeding. We believe that an in-camera hearing before the judge, wouldn't include the police department, an in-camera hearing between the judge, the defense, and the prosecutor is the best way to solve this problem. Allow all of the components of the process to come together in the judge's chambers and ask for an unsealing of the records. Not public unsealing, not unsealing for the police, simply for the judge to make a determination based on a fact-based timeline where they have to see what the thing is. We know for sure that in family court there's going to be situations where you look at the fact pattern and you say, yeah, sure, this person should go to family court. We should remove this youth to family court. We'd like every youth to go to family court. But when you're seeing 3 and 4 gun arrests, gang assaults, stabbings, and things like that, at some point we have to turn around and say, what we're doing in family court is not working for this particular youth. And it's also, conversely, not working for the community at large. We're seeing lots of people, innocent bystanders being shot. We're seeing children being shot. Some of these shootings are, where it may be one person struck, but there's 4 and 5 and 6 people on the corner. At other times, we're not seeing murders, but we're seeing 4 and 5 people struck, actually. And this is all being driven by the 16 and 17-year-old shooter. We also think they're being exploited by older gang members who now refer to them in Yonkers, at least, as holsters, because they know there are no consequences. The 18-year-old and the 18-year-old plus crowd gets a pass, and they're allowed to continue and have these kids do this. We understand brain science, and the brain isn't developed, especially for male brains, until 25. And we don't let people drive until 16, and sometimes I even think that's a mistake. But when you look at the brain science of a youth male, in particularly males, their brains aren't developed. They don't have the ability to put the brakes on this kind of thing. We understand that there's a lot of kids that are suffering from trauma. We support that. We support rehabilitative systems nothing would make us happier just to have kids stop violence and not use evidence-based methodology to try to get to that point. But until then, what I say to everybody is, what about tonight? What do we do tonight? How do we stop this shooter who's already been in 2 shootings, maybe has 3 gun arrests, and it goes on and on until there's a murder? So what I'm asking you for is that in-camera hearing between the judge, the prosecutor, and the defense, and have them evaluate the criminal history to make sure that they should either be removed to youth part or they should stay in family court.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I come to you today from the great city of Rochester, where we've had 324 shooting events with people hit this year and 62 homicides. My name is Patrick Fallon. I'm the Executive Director of the New York City Association of Chiefs of Police. I am the former Chief of Police of the Town of Greece Police Department. Thank you for inviting me to testify before you today, along with my colleagues from Yonkers and NYPD. Since 1901, the New York State Association of Chiefs of Police has been dedicated to serving the people of the state of New York. in the maintenance of law and order and supporting the more than 500 chiefs of police around the state as they carry out the functions of their office. We are an association made up of police chiefs, commissioners, superintendents, executives, administrators, agents in charge. Our members are the most experienced and respected law enforcement officials in the state from most law enforcement agencies in the state, including village, town, county, city, state, and federal agencies, as well as railroad police. Our primary objectives are uniformity in policing operations throughout the state and advancement of the general welfare of the police profession through education and training. The primary purpose of the association is an educational one, to gather, disseminate, and promote useful and necessary information to law enforcement agencies of the state of New York. Our ultimate aim is to continually improve our policing profession as a means to a more efficient, effective, fair, and accountable criminal justice system. As part of my job, I talk every day to chiefs from all corners of New York, from Suffolk to Buffalo, Syracuse to New York City, Albany to Rochester, and the towns and villages in between. Over the years, one common theme has become clear to us in these conversations: the system was not adequately serving the victims of crime, particularly young victims, and even the young offenders who go through the revolving door of a system which does not do nearly enough to make sure they don't fall through the cracks. You were right to focus on legislation on fixing this inequitable system, but the changes to the law have not had the desired effect. As the commissioner spoke to in great detail, the bail and discovery laws need to change to keep New Yorkers safe and protect victims and witnesses, while also treating the accused fairly. What we needed were rational bail reforms that wouldn't keep poor defendants behind bars when an identical richer defendant could walk out of jail after arraignment, while also keeping communities safe from the worst of the worst, regardless of their ability to post bail. What we needed were rational discovery reforms that would give defendants adequate and timely access to relevant evidence to allow a more educated plea bargain, while at the same time protecting witnesses and victims from dangerous criminals. A reformed discovery law that would also not unduly burden police departments and district attorneys' offices with onerous, burdensome, and meaningless discovery requirements that would kill solid cases against dangerous felons on technicalities and drive assistant DAs out of their office. What we need were rational reforms in the way of young people that were treated within the criminal justice system, while also recognizing the unfortunate reality that a small number of youths do habitually endanger those around them. However, the legislation passed in recent years while attempting to achieve these goals created significant structural damage to our criminal justice system, damage that is impacting communities across the state, and more specifically, damage that is re-victimizing our crime victims. We are seeing these effects every day in our cities with skyrocketing numbers of shootings and victims, and the release and re-release of dangerous recidivists back into communities already on the brink. That is why in the coming weeks, the New York State Association of Chiefs of Police will be proposing legislation and amendments which we feel strike the appropriate balance between safety and fairness. We will not propose the repeal of reforms that you have enacted. We will instead work within your framework to make precise amendments on proposals that are both common sense and fair, proposals that will address the interests of crime victims and the need for all communities across the state to be safe as the safest communities. We in the New York State Association of Chiefs of Police look forward to partnering with you to address these vital issues. Thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're going to go to questions. Is there something I said? He's not there. Of course, I certainly look forward to working with all of you and with everybody on these issues. While what you talked about was certainly not on the agenda for today, I certainly was interested in hearing it. The focus is actually on other areas. But I will say for the record that I read a very interesting story, I guess a week or two ago in the New York Times, which discussed the rise in crime throughout the country. And it's my understanding that while there have been increases in crime in New York, certainly very troubling, it's not a phenomenon limited to New York. Chicago, for example, has recently experienced an unbelievable, I don't want to use the word spike. Spike sort of suggests something relatively small, but an enormous increase in shootings and in murders.
Yeah.
As far as I know, they haven't gone through bail reform or any of the other reforms that took place in New York. And I think that's true in most, if not all, areas of the country. I'm not the expert, but I think the one thing that is true throughout the country is COVID. I believe that COVID has certainly helped increase, exacerbated, and has just been very bad in terms of crime statistics. I think we could all agree on that. And the circumstances around the country are different from New York in terms of the reforms that took place, but not in terms of the increase. So I'm not sure if the reforms may or may not have impacted. I mean, obviously you believe that they have certainly impacted crime rates, but that wouldn't explain what's happened everywhere. It's just been a very horrible time throughout the country, and I certainly have a lot of confidence in the police in New York City to do their job, but I don't think the answers are simple. I'm not sure you can directly connect all these changes to one that took place to what's happened in New York any more than you can connect the lack of bail reform and other changes in Chicago to the increase in rates. But what I'm going to do is first I just want to do a follow-up question, Commissioner. I think you may have said it, but I just want to make sure. How many of the shootings in New York, let's say in the past year or during this calendar year or maybe last year, were by people who were recently arrested for another shooting crime during the period?
Can you ask that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah. How many of the arrests were arrests of people who were out on the streets having been arrested for another shooting during the period? In other words, were there people out who with no bail, for example, or bail being set and they made bail, I don't know, and then committed another shooting and were arrested again for basically the same crime?
I'll answer that, and my testimony has the hard numbers, but the spirit of your question I think I got. When you look at who we arrest for crimes, it's going to be small numbers, but what we're seeing is an increase of people that are committing shootings that have open gun arrests, or people that are committing shootings getting out while out on bail or no bail on unrelated charges. All of those percentages are rising to an alarming level, but when you look at the entirety of how many shooting arrests we make and the percentage, it's not dramatic numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Could I speak to your earlier point, just one brief comment, just on the bail across the country?
Yes.
I have, we've known each other a long time. I have 30 years with the police department. I ran comm staff for the NYPD. I think I have a singular view of what makes crime tick in New York City. I speak to police executives across this country. You're absolutely right that bail reform was unique here. It's not about bail reform per se. It's about systems that are repeatedly putting criminals back on the streets. And that is, when I speak to Chicago, when I speak to LA, when I speak to police leaders across this country, we are all seeing the same thing. I think there's an incredible opportunity here to, as the commissioner said, minor changes, not sweeping changes. One of the things I'm most proud of is how we drove crime down in New York City and drove incarceration down. We used to make 422,000 arrests, over 400,000 arrests. It was too many. The stops, the arrests, the summonses. We drove it all down with help, sometimes with our arm behind our back, but more often than not, voluntarily. And we drove it down and drove crime down. But we know what we're talking about here. And I think many ways there's a breakdown of trust. We talk about the trust between the community and the police, and that's not perfect. But I'm proud of the work we've done in that area too. But I think there's a breakdown of trust where we're not believed what we're saying here. We know what we're saying. I wish this was COVID, because then the vaccines would take care of this problem. The vaccines are not going to make this problem go away. And money is really important and investing in communities is really important, and I support all of that. I support all of that. But we need to make the community safe to give that money a chance to have the entire community flourish. And that's why this concerns us so much.
Okay, so now let me get to a couple of questions sort of on point to the agenda. The ammunition sales database that was called for in the 2013 SAFE Act has still not been established, as we mentioned earlier. What do you think would be the benefits of recording and tracking ammunition sales in New York?
I believe personally, we have far too many guns. It's been said in the earlier speakers. From the iron pipeline to the guns that are recovered here. I heard some bills that were mentioned in the discussion here today. I'd be willing to stand with you, in solidarity, whether it's state bills or federal bills. We have to do more to sensibly have databases that reduce the possibility of straw purchases, whether it's for guns or ammunition. And I am 100% behind that. It's far too easy to get firearms.
Have you, or actually any of you, observed whether or not there's been an increase in the number of guns seized since the beginning of the pandemic?
We have seen an increase in New York City over the last 2 years, 25-year highs in gun arrests that are being made.
Okay. Patrice, do you have any questions? Okay, I'm going to go back. Don't worry. Okay. Go.
Thank you for your testimony today. I would like to just also submit my comments with Chair Dinowitz with respect to the spike in crime and shootings all across the country, yet the lack of the existence of the criminal justice reforms as here in New York, but we're still seeing the rise in shootings and incidences across the country. And so I am concerned about what your thoughts are with respect to whether or not, knowing that there have been these increases across the country, whether or not you can state with a certain modicum of certainty that bail reform was the impetus of that spike here in New York as well as across the country.
I think what we can say with certainty is that we're seeing people arrested for gun crimes that are being immediately released back onto the street. So I don't know what's causing crime in California or Illinois, but I know in New York that across the state we're seeing people arrested for gun crime and then released back on the street, and in often cases across the state rearrested for other gun crimes.
Thank you. Commissioner Shea?
Yeah. I would say that there's many factors involved. When you look at COVID, for example, the stress that it has put on the entire country, including New York City and New York State, undeniably has impacts. I think people are going to be studying this for quite some time. I think the court system, and that's directly related to COVID as well. The shutdown of the court system has created incredible obstacles for us in New York City. When you look at the bigger picture, which I tend to do, when you start looking at arrests that are being made, they're still being processed, but they're immediately put back on the street. When I look at data points such as what's the 10-year history with New York City and Rikers Island and how prisoners then move from Rikers Island to state prisons, how many routinely move month by month over the last 10 years? Look at the period starting last May, June, when the court shut down. The faucet was shut down. Mm-hmm. And how that balance impact translates downstream to, if you look at Rikers Island population, if you look at state prison populations, which we are consciously trying to drive down, but smartly and safely, but they've dropped so drastically, and it's related to everything that we're seeing right now.
So the mayor's Office of Criminal Justice has data that shows that more than 99% of the people awaiting resolution of their criminal case in the community, as opposed to at Rikers Island, are not rearrested for any alleged felony offense, which, as you know, includes murder, shootings, and gun possession. This was true before bail reform in 2019 and after in 2020. The rearrest rate for alleged violent felonies remain about 0.5%. Yet you and your precinct commanders persist in telling New Yorkers that bail reform increased violence in our communities. Do you believe in the math that was suggested by the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice? And in addition to that, Liz Glazer, who was the head of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, has also authored or co-authored a report that shows that low incarceration rates does not necessarily affect pretrial and pretrial jailing and murder rates. So I would like to know what are your thoughts are with respect to the fact that the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice has indicated that most people who are waiting pretrial proceedings as it really, and they're not being rearrested on felony offenses.
I'll speak after. Yeah.
Could I just answer that? So you're absolutely right. And just what I want to say, too, is this is our effort to try to solve a problem. It's not being accusatory about bail reform. But you're absolutely right. A very, very, very small subset of the population commits crime. What we're talking about with respect to bail reform and raise the age is focusing on that less than 0.5% that you're talking about. Yeah. So let's make it let's say this conversely. The overwhelming majority of people don't commit crime. They're not recidivists, they don't reoffend and reoffend and reoffend. The whole point of precision policing, and I think we employ a precision policing model in the Yonkers Police, and I know the NYPD does, is that it's offender-centric. So you're focusing on the most persistent offenders in every crime category. Doesn't have to be necessarily gun violence, it can be larceny from autos. I can tell you, like, for example, if we have 30 larceny from autos in a given month in a 4th precinct in Yonkers, that those larceny from autos are not being committed by 30 different individuals doing one each. 20 of them, and 20 of them are being committed by one person, the other 10 are being committed by another. So the point is that what we're saying is, yes, the overwhelming majority of people should not be in pretrial detention, but we are saying there are people there that are driving our crime numbers in every crime category, that we need to have the tools to keep them in custody because they're the ones who are really victimizing the population. And again, less than 0.5%.
Sorry. In June of 2020, Commissioner Shea, you blamed bail reform for a rise in shootings, but a New York Post analysis of the NYPD's own data found that claim to be false. The analysis found that there were 528 shootings from January 1st of 2020 until June 30th of 2020. However, only one person released due to bail reform was charged with a shooting. Do you agree with the New York Post that that was a false claim that you made?
Madam, I don't generally hold debates over what appears in the paper, respectfully.
Okay, I have another example. Just this Tuesday, in an interview with 1010 Win, you claimed that New York's bail reform upended the system, and you went on to blame a Jeffrey Evans for a mugging that he never committed. The department had to correct your claim after learning that Mr. Evans was actually incarcerated while the mugging took place. Was your gross identification of Mr. Evans based on the NYPD's use of faulty facial recognition technology?
I do not know the case you're referring to. I think that where we should focus our efforts here is, I think we all want the same thing. I think we want safe streets for our children, safe streets for all the members of the community. I can tell you that's what I hear every day when I'm out throughout New York City, from Bed-Stuy and Brooklyn to Washington Heights. As we sat here today, we had a 14-year-old shot in Harlem, getting off a New York City bus. The numbers, Liz Glazer is a friend of mine. I consider her a friend. She's a very smart woman. I've worked closely with her for 7 years. We worked together, me in my prior role, and her in her role as director of MOCJ. We didn't always agree, but we respected each other and we worked collaboratively to try to accomplish what we did in New York City. In 2016, 17, and 18, we accomplished what was the envy of every police department and every city in this country.
Well, I do agree that whenever there's a shooting that takes place, even my own brother was murdered at 19 years old, and I understand how that the effect that it doesn't just have on the shooter or the shooting victim, but also the family. And children are maimed each and every day due to gun violence in our communities. But I also believe that it is possible to maintain public safety while at the same time protecting the very sacred constitutional rights that this country affords to each and every citizen equally and equitably. And I believe that that's just a focus that we have been committed to with respect to the criminal justice reforms. I would like to have a further conversation with you as well with respect to gun sales, which are taking place over social media, and sort of, we know what the iron pipeline is coming up from the south to New York. But the World Wide Web has created its own existence of a pipeline for gun sales, which are winding up on the streets of the city of New York, including the district that I represent. But I would love to talk to you more about it, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time today.
Okay, thank you. Mike.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Commissioner, for coming here today to testify. So I'm not sure if I'm on the microphone, but I don't think it matters, correct? That's okay?
Well, it probably should matter to you.
Commissioner, during your career, and more so now after the Raise the Age was enacted, have you encountered situations where perhaps gang members have influenced or utilized younger individuals to carry guns, to commit acts of violence, knowing that those young individuals perhaps would not face significant repercussions?
Yes.
Or had a higher likelihood of not facing repercussions?
That's something that is seen quite frequently.
And also, I just want to go off something that the chairman stated previously. I know the chairman talked about various cities around the country. Irrespective of whether there were bail reform laws passed or not, were these cities part of a movement called the Defund the Police movement in most of their respective cities, including Chicago?
That I don't know. I don't know what happened in every city, but what I could tell you is that in speaking to police executives, and I'm going this year current, back years, so before we ever heard of COVID or anything else, situations where criminals are getting out over and over and committing crimes is the common factor there, and that's the one that, frankly, we need some help with.
Could I also say something to that, sir? And I think what we've seen is we've employed, as I talked about, a precision policing model, which we think is like a policing state of grace. Minimal law enforcement footprint, maximum public safety. What you're seeing across the country, and I think what one of the things is driving, I know that Mr. Chair mentioned Chicago, is that prosecutors' offices aren't following a precision prosecution model. And this can be done constitutionally, it can be done legally, it can be done lawfully to keep people off the street. I think that the key is, as always, is focusing on the most violent, the most prolific offenders, doing everything you can to put them in custody, and then everyone else can just live their life. That's kind of, and so if you're asking about a defund the police movement, I don't know, but I also know that there are prosecutors' offices that have not done their jobs, in my opinion, and not tried to, take the most violent people off the street, and it has had a public safety impact.
And Assembly Member, if I could clarify as well, what I don't want is for there to be a perception that the proposals that we're making here is advocating for some sort of mass incarceration. I think the Assembly Member said it right, that there is a small number of individuals that are recidivizing, committing the crimes. We want to focus on those individuals. When we're saying let judges have the ability to remand based on dangerousness, we're not asking for a free-for-all, we're asking for safeguards within that system. So, for example, the proposal would be a judge could take a look at the nature of the violent crime, the criminal history of the individual. Based on that, if the judge decides that I'm going to remand this individual, what then would happen, or what we're advocating for, is an independent review before a different judge to take a look to see if that judge was correct. The original judge deciding to remand would have to state on the record why he believes the individual is dangerous, or she. And that review is the safeguards that we need. If you want to create a reporting requirement to see if particular judges have propensities to incarcerate or to remand certain individuals or remand en masse, there are safeguards that could be created. But what we're talking about is a really precise fix to the law. We're in agreement. We're actually asking for something I guess some would call more radical than what was done. We're advocating for an abolition of cash bail altogether. We think that by creating a list of crimes that are bail eligible, we're actually saying it's okay to continue inequity for this list of crimes, but stop the inequity for the other list of crimes. So get rid of cash bail altogether. Let's focus on the small number of people, as the Assembly member said, on the small number of people that are driving the crime in our districts.
And just to go off of that, you would agree, Commissioner, and when I pose the question to the panel, that obviously, no two cases are ever alike.
That's right.
Correct? Everything is subjective. Would you agree with that? That no two defendants are alike, no two facts are alike. It's a subjective decision made by a judge.
Yes.
At that time. Is that correct?
Yes, and if I could, to the judge question, I know these are hard decisions, but if you take a hard look at what happens in a courtroom, we trust the judges to allow what witnesses are allowed to come before the trial. We trust the judges to make decisions on what evidence is admissible. We trust, sometimes the judge, there's no jury, and the judge is the final arbiter. The judge has he or she, incredible power in that courtroom already. When there's a finding of guilt, we go to the judge and say, is it 5 years? We're taking someone's liberty away for 5 years. Or is it probation? Incredible power. But on this singular issue, where we need help right now, we don't trust the judge. And we think there's an opportunity to maybe rethink that.
And these are judges that are either appointed or elected by the counties that they serve, correct?
Yes, and transparency for what the judges do. If we have a problem with the police commissioner, get rid of the police commissioner. If we have a problem with judges, get rid of the judge. And create a system where that allows accountability and transparency, but also lets judges make what many would consider common sense decisions on a fraction, drive incarceration down and get the streets safer.
And just to follow up on that, were any of you consulted significantly before the bail reform laws were enacted?
We were the main voice.
No, we took part in the conversation after the vote, and we highlighted some of the issues with it, but
you were not consulted?
No.
I was not consulted, but I will say, given all credit to the Senate Majority Leader Andrew Stewart-Cousins, Nader Sage, Assemblyman Sage, Senator Shelley Mayer came together with us in June when we started to see, particularly with bail reform, to one of the Assemblyman's comments, I see raise the age as more of an issue for gun violence. I see bail reform more of an issue for property crimes, but that's just Yonkers. But to your point, we were not consulted, but to their credit, our legislative group in Yonkers and Westchester got together and we sat down with them. We made some modifications to the law and it did get better. What we're saying here now is just a little bit more refinement will get us a lot better.
Well, the only thing I would add is we support those laws. A 15, 16-year-old kid, we're going to mar that kid for life because he does what kids do. We supported raising the age there. We supported fixing inequities where somebody's sitting in jail because they don't have money in their bank account. These are hard, complicated issues. Is it COVID? Is it the courts? Is it this bill? These are hard things that there's not always a black and white. So the fact that we're having this conversation, I view as a positive, that we're trying to just make minor fixes to move forward. It's not blame. It's not anything. The laws were well-intentioned and accomplished a lot of good. We can make it better, we think.
No, I
Okay,
appreciate
you got to wrap up, Chris.
I'll be very, very
You sort of
quick,
doubled your time.
just to make sure, one last question I have for you, Commissioner.
Yes,
From
sir.
the guns recovered in New York City, would you be able to give us an amount as far as percentage of how many of those guns originate from out of state, or perhaps stolen out of state, and which compared to the guns that are, sold legally within New York State?
Our main problem is guns coming from out of state where they're purchased legally and then shipped up, the use of straw purchases I heard the comment about guns being stolen before, which is a real problem. I would just throw also on the table, we know that there's a lot of fraud with that. So one of the common practices is go down south, buy the gun legally, then report it stolen when in fact it wasn't stolen, and then it makes its way up to New York
So
City.
vast majority come from out of state and then are defaced once they're here. Is that correct?
Coming from out of state, yes, not the majority
legally bought in New
defaced.
York State.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Tom?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to get back to the topic that we were here for, but before we do that, I'm not hearing the law as I understood it being described the way I understood it. My understanding was that judges have the right to set bail if they have a repeat offender in front of them. If somebody is arrested, let out, and then gets rearrested, that's relevant. The judge can now set bail, as I understand it. Is that correct?
Well,
It's more complicated than that. I'll let Oleg, but one of the things that's missing from that description is the most affordable piece, and that's where we recommended in the testimony we could make small fixes.
yeah, Assemblymember, what you're talking about is a provision in the law that said if you're out on a felony and you're arrested for another felony, then, and it's not a qualifying offense, the judge may now consider
Right.
bail or possibly even remand, depending on the type of crime.
Right, but that is in the statute. The judges are just not using that.
Well, no, that's not correct. So yes, it is in the statute, but the issue is, and the issue we keep highlighting, this is not a problem that could be fixed by adding more bail-eligible crimes to the list. Because what happened in this law, the fundamental change to the law, was that judges are now forced to only use the least restrictive means to assure your appearance.
But the judge can determine what the least restrictive means is, correct?
Right, but keep this in mind. If you have an individual that's been arrested before, shows up for every court date, and gets arrested again, he's not a flight risk. And the judge can only base their decision on risk of flight, not dangerousness. So you have an individual that keeps committing recidivizing.
Yeah, but that's always been the statute. That's always been the standard.
Well, but then what happens?
So the judges could interpret risk of flight any way they want
No.
if they have a repeat offender in front of them.
So let me correct that again. So
Well, I think we disagree on the interpretation of the statute.
Well, but not exactly, because the language of the statute is this, that one, least restrictive means was written into the new law. That did not exist prior to this law being written in. Two, the concept of if a judge gets to bail, so it's remand, release on own recognizance, won't assure appearance, release with conditions, won't assure. Now the judge gets to bail. Now the judge has to make an assessment on whether the bail amount
I understand
causes but this is
right.
important for me to say, whether the bail amount causes an undue hardship. So what we're seeing based on data and numbers is judges, when they are getting to bail, are setting a much lower bail. Individuals are getting out.
Well,
because they're
I'm
able
looking
to
at
make
Rikers
the-
Island. It's full again, so it's clearly not happening in New York City.
Rikers Island is it's the lowest period that I've seen in 30 years.
Right, but it's still full.
It is not full, sir.
Well, okay, I guess, again, we're looking at the same thing and coming to different conclusions. But my understanding also was with gun-related crimes, the judge could set bail, correct?
Once again, it's the framework. You're looking at, is a gun crime on the list of bail-eligible offenses? Yes, it is. What exists in the law is the judge is bound by this new framework that was created to only set least restrictive means and set an affordable bail that doesn't result in undue hardship. The bail amounts have dropped. More people are, if it gets to bail, they're either getting released on own recognizance or with conditions, but if the judge is getting to bail, the bail amount is significantly lower, and those individuals are back out on the street within hours.
I think you're interpreting it differently than we had intended it. We didn't think that it was necessary to say in there should be more restrictive than necessary to bring him back. But our intent was for judges to be able to set bail for people who are repeat offenders. And I think we're going to have a separate conversation on this issue. And maybe we can have a round table or something to discuss the difference of interpretation.
But I'd also like to speak to that point. And I think that was our point, too, is that no one is saying that we thought that there was anything other than the best of intentions. But we now have 2 years' worth of data to share with you,
Okay.
to say that regardless of the intent, the way the law is being looked at by judges has driven up our, in Yonkers particularly, property crime numbers. Like I said, raise the age, gun violence for Yonkers is
Right.
property crimes
Right.
for bail reform.
Let me go back to the topic of the day. We were talking about trying to determine the impact of not having the database. And I'm understanding, Commissioner, for example, you are in favor of having all of these databases and all of this help. Who helps you today? If you find a gun in a crime and you're trying to trace it, where do you get the resources? Does the state police help you? Are there agencies out there? What do you do?
Yes, primarily we get the information from the ATF. We have task forces sitting literally as we are sitting here, NYPD, state police, ATF on task forces together. We've recently cut down the time that we get that information where you can. I think there's also opportunities when you recover a gun. You would love to have a situation where everything is electronic. That's not the case. So sometimes when the gun is purchased, let's say in Virginia, there may be an initial record, but then it passed hands 4 times, and you're dealing with paper, and you will not get those records. So there's opportunities there. I would love to partner with anyone that I'm speaking
Well,
with.
wasn't that the intent of our statute in the first place, to do that?
I'm not sure which statute you're referring to.
When we passed the law requiring, for example, the ammunition background checks and database, wasn't that the intent of that statute, to do exactly what you're saying?
I'm not sure, so I don't want to misspeak.
Well, all right, let me just put it this way. Having the database would be helpful to you, correct?
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely.
Do you all agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Like Commissioner Shea said, what we do is we take these cases where an illegal gun ends up killing someone and we identify the gun. What you try to do is work backwards. So you go from where we found the gun to the last purchaser and back, but it's paper. So we'll send Yonkers detectives down with ATF agents to Virginia or Delaware or Georgia, wherever the gun originated from, and try to work that way. It's very time consuming, it's very difficult. To have an electronic database would make things much easier.
Yes.
What about the concept of microstamping? That would help too, wouldn't it?
Yes.
You all agree on that?
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah, there would just be a limited immediate impact. I mean, it's a good thing, no question about it, but you got to remember that there's millions of guns in circulation
Right.
currently in the United
Well,
States.
no one of these,
And that
no
would
one solution is going to solve all the problems.
Correct.
What we're trying to do is piece together enough to give you the resources to find where these illegal guns came from and trace them back and get them off the street.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask another question?
Did you say one? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to, I want to ask you guys if this statement is true. Okay? These following crimes are not, if a defendant is charged with these crimes, they are not eligible for bail. Criminal sale of a firearm to a minor, C felony. Criminal possession or disposal of a weapon, D felony. Criminal possession of a firearm, E felony. Is it true that if an individual was charged with that crime and went to court, he would not be eligible for bail?
I mean, Assembly Member, I'd have to take a look at the list of crimes. I mean, the list is all violent felonies are eligible for bail, and then there are additional crimes that are eligible for bail on top. I'd have to see if those are classified as violent felonies in the penal law. But the point remains, and this is the point we were making before, is you can literally take the entire penal law, misdemeanor and felony, and you can take every other book of law that exists in New York State. You could make them all bail eligible without actually fundamentally changing the concept of risk of flight versus dangerousness. What you're doing is you're allowing dangerous people that show up for court back out onto the street to victimize more people, right? Dangerousness is standard. Should it have parameters, guardrails, safety nets, have independent reviews? Yes, that's what we're all advocating for. We're advocating for a tiny percentage of people that we know are recidivizing and committing violent crimes, that are victimizing people, that are killing our kids. Those are the people we want the system to focus on, and the people that aren't recidivists, that aren't violent, they shouldn't be in. Bail shouldn't be set for them. They shouldn't be remanded. They'll be out. They're not victimizing the communities over and over again. They committed a crime. They're going to have their day in court. It's going to move forward. But the individuals that keep committing these crimes,
Well, I don't want to get into that right now.
why should there be a process that says, as long as you show up for your court date, you can go right back out there? That's what we have now.
Just one question, just one clarification if I can. The words dangerousness were never in New York State statute, correct?
The words dangerousness were never in the New York state law. However, prior to the framework changing on least restrictive means and no undue hardship, judges actually looked at the level of danger
Right, but
and would set higher bail amounts.
But they never had the specific authorization to do that.
Correct, but they had an
Thank you.
avenue to do that was taken away from them.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, we have David Saws, Albany County DA, also past president of the DA's Association of New York, as well as Jason Furman, senior advisor and special counsel to the New York State Office of the Attorney General.
He's like their counsel, basically, like their legal expert. He's the one who can answer some of the questions.
Okay, are we ready? Who's first?
Good afternoon. I insist.
He insists, so you go first.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This is on. Begin with brief remarks. I promise brevity and engagement. Illegal guns in the hands of criminals and irresponsible youth are posing the greatest threat to public safety in our state. In communities like Albany, we're experiencing more shootings, finding more shell casings, seeing more bodies, some intended targets and some of innocent bystanders. With every shot fired from an illegal gun, we're also witnessing the confidence of an already vulnerable community shaken and destroyed. In the city of Albany, we've had 176 confirmed shots fired incidents as of this week. Of the 176 confirmed shots fired, 56 were shooting incidents resulting in 82 people being hit, with 14 fatalities. But for access to emergency services and skilled medical practitioners in the Capital District, our number of fatalities would be much higher, much, much higher. Violence involving illegal guns is not just a local problem. Substitute me with a colleague from Orange County, Onondaga, Erie County, and adjust slightly for population density, and our issues would be similar. Recent FBI publications highlighting national crime trends suggest that crimes involving illegal guns are a national problem. The difference is, in New York, we are still adjusting to new, mostly good, certainly well-meaning reforms that police and prosecutors are finding out are now making it harder to fight this wave of violence. If we do nothing, then this insufferable condition will be the new norm. And let me remind you that the norm I reference will not be the norm for you and me. The volume and frequency of violence will be the norm for poor communities and communities of color. The policies you shape here at the Capitol will impact thousands of lives in our state. Let me offer 3 modest observations and recommendations. First, New York must reconsider the focus of its response to illegal gun violence. Second, it must invest in an infrastructure to become the first gun crime networked state in the country. Third, you must bring New York in line with every other state that has eliminated cash bail by granting judges the ability to consider public safety. Let's start with the first observation. Policymakers and journalists often conflate mass shootings like Sandy Hook with the everyday pandemic of illegal gun crimes we see in our streets. They are not the same. The guns used in mass shootings are often legally obtained, and so legislation to address them focuses on access and specific features of the gun. But the guns used by gangs in Albany flow illegally across state borders, outside the state legislator's reach. Perversely, further laws to constrain the legal marketplace will only strengthen and enhance the illegal marketplace. What is needed to stop the flow, what is needed is for us to collectively engage in procedures and processes that will stop the flow of illegal guns from across our borders. I would therefore encourage this body to make investments in both time and energy to explore the initiatives underway by the NYPD and the ATF, which has developed the most comprehensive and effective gun crime intelligence centers in the nation. Through the use of national integrated ballistics information networks, detectives and prosecutors can link crimes, identify groups involved in shootings, and pinpoint where the illegal guns are coming from. Shell casings recovered from crime scenes or seized weapons are rapidly tested, providing actionable intelligence. The reports will reflect when a gun was born and how it has lived its life. In essence, it's a DNA database for guns. Data includes date in which the report was purchased, where the report was purchased, and by whom. The report will also indicate the time between purchases and the first crime that gun is involved with. This body should invest and establish a CJIC in every city and region in the state through DCJS. Linking data across the state is the only way that communities will understand the size and the scale of their marketplace for illegal guns. The data produced by the CJIC will also enable federal law enforcement to pursue cases against irresponsible dealers and straw purchases beyond our state borders. Finally, as my colleagues repeated here prior to my taking this seat, New York is the only state in the nation to deny judges the ability to consider public safety in determining bail. Even states that have eliminated cash bail allow courts to override the presumption of release through a dangerousness analysis. If courts cannot consider the reality that certain defendants pose a risk to public safety, then courts are not serving public justice or public safety. Under the reforms, most people caught red-handed with an illegal gun are released with no or historically low bail. Many are released with little or no supervision. Quick release and repeat of gun offenders undermines the effectiveness of law enforcement. It also disregards our victims and witnesses, and it discourages them from reporting crimes and continues the cycle of violence. I would also suggest that certain aspects of Raise the Age, a statute that was passed several years ago, which in many ways have addressed so many issues in our system, I would certainly encourage this body to revisit how we treat 16 and 17-year-olds who possess illegal firearms. That is the conclusion of my remarks today. I'm looking forward to an engagement with you all and certainly hope that this is the beginning of this dialogue and not the end. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we hear from Mr. Furman, and then we'll ask questions of either of you.
Good afternoon, and I apologize in advance. My remarks are not quite as brief as one might like, but I'm here to speak on Attorney General James's behalf, and she's sorry she couldn't be here.
His weren't that brief, actually.
I'm going to panic when this red light is beeping. Good morning, good afternoon, Chair Dinowitz and other distinguished committee members. Thank you for inviting our office to testify at today's hearing and for your tireless efforts to ensure that New York continues to be a national leader in the fight against gun violence. When we talk about gun violence, we are talking about a public safety and public health crisis on an almost unimaginable scale. 39,000 Americans are killed by firearms every year. Guns are the leading cause of death for children, ahead of car crashes and cancer. To be clear, American gun violence is not simply a crime crisis. It is a public health crisis of epidemic proportions, and it is getting worse. For nearly a decade, the violent crime rate has held steady at roughly half its 1990s peak. Yet, according to CDC data, more Americans were killed by guns in each of 2017, 2018, and 2019 than any previous year on record. Even with the spike in homicides during the COVID-19 pandemic, the violent crime rate remained historically low. However, based on preliminary data, it is all but certain that more Americans died by gunfire in 2020 than in any other year in modern history. Part of the reason is that ready access to guns makes it exponentially easier to take a life in an instant. That means more gun homicides, more people killed by police, more accidental shooting deaths, more deadly intimate partner and family violence, and statistically, most of all, more suicides by firearm. In fact, of the 39,000 Americans who die by gunfire every year, nearly 2/3 are the victims of suicide. It is also essential to make clear that any racist dog whistle assertion that our gun violence epidemic boils down to black-on-black crime or urban anarchy is at odds with reality. It is true that people of color, particularly black men, are exponentially more likely to be the victims of firearm murders and police homicides, and that gun violence is disproportionately concentrated on impoverished urban neighborhoods. However, it is also true that nearly 3/4 of gun suicide victims are white men. that Alaska has the highest rate of gun deaths in the country, and Wyoming the highest rate of gun suicides. This is an epidemic that affects all of us everywhere. Thanks to this legislature's leadership and some of the strongest gun laws in the nation, New York is better equipped than nearly any other state to combat and contain the spread of the gun violence epidemic within our state borders. And we know empirically that those strong gun laws are effective because New York has the third lowest gun homicide rate and second lowest rate of interstate crime gun exports in the nation. In a role as Chief Counsel of the state, Attorney General James is proud to defend those laws from any and all challenge. And as the state's chief law enforcement officer and the people's lawyer, AG James is committed to using those laws and every other tool at her disposal to protect and defend the state and its citizens from the ravages of gun violence. However, the AG also shares this body's belief that no matter how strong our laws, we cannot afford to say we've done enough when so many of our brothers and sisters are dying. Not when gun violence costs the state nearly $6 billion every year, or when more than 800 New Yorkers die by firearm every year. Not when of those hundreds of New Yorkers whose lives are tragically cut short by gunfire every year, more than 60 are children. New Yorkers are not immune from this epidemic, so we must use every tool available to us and never stop searching for more. And like this legislature, Attorney General James has a long history of doing just that. As Attorney General, she has made use of every tool to fight this epidemic by partnering with federal, state, and local law enforcement to investigate and take down major multi-state gun trafficking rings, by using New York's automatic weapons ban to stop 17 ghost gun dealers from doing business in this state, by going to court to prevent the spread of 3D printed guns in the face of federal abdication, and by leading coalitions of attorneys general from across the country to file lawsuits, amicus briefs, and regulatory actions. But the stark reality is that while our laws have proven effective, and while we have many public officials with long histories of fighting gun violence and the will to keep fighting, epidemics know no borders. The overwhelming majority of guns used to commit crimes in our state were originally purchased elsewhere, mostly from states that do not have our strong gun laws. In fact, as you know, and as has been mentioned here, such a disproportionate number of New York crime guns were originally purchased in and trafficked through a string of states joined together by I-95 that the route these guns travel is commonly called the Iron Pipeline. And increasingly in recent years, we are seeing new strains of this plague emerge. Most alarmingly, perhaps, are ghost guns, untraceable, unserialized, DIY home assembly firearms that can become fully operational killing machines in the span of an hour. Ghost guns are designed specifically to evade federal regulations and thus federal and state law. And it is clear that the business model relies on putting guns in the hands of individuals who are legally prohibited from having them. And that threat is growing. Police across New York State recovered nearly 5 times as many ghost guns in 2020 as in 2018. Our office has made fighting the scourge of ghost guns a priority, shutting down dealers that violated New York law. For years, we have legislated, litigated, regulated, advocated, and agitated with full knowledge that what happens in our nation's capital and the capitals of other states impacts our constituents as much or more as our own efforts. That new threats designed to evade the laws that do exist, like 3D printed guns or ghost guns, will not stop coming. But the odds we face go beyond the fact that we can't sit here in Albany and pass laws for South Carolina, or that it seems almost impossible to get 60 votes in the U.S. Senate for even the most common sense public safety measures. Gun violence is the only public health crisis where basic efforts to reduce the staggering human and economic toll are sabotaged or even forbidden by law. As this body knows, in 2005, Congress took unprecedented action to usurp states' rights and give gun manufacturers and distributors blanket immunity for gun violence perpetrated as a direct result of their marketing and distribution when it passed the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or PLACA. Thankfully, this past session, this legislature passed a bill by Assemblymember Fahey and Senator Myrie, which aims to restore the ability to bring civil actions against firearm makers and merchants who do business in this state. As AG James has publicly stated, she looks forward to enforcing this new law and stands ready to defend it against any and all legal challenge. Unfortunately, PLACA is far from the only federal statutory obstruction we face in our fight against this epidemic. While the list is too long for this testimony, even this overlong testimony, perhaps the most relevant and insidious examples are budget riders, commonly known as the T-Hart amendments. Under T-Hart, the federal government is barred from sharing and even preserving certain essential gun records and trace data. By law, approved gun sale background checks must be destroyed within 24 hours. Gun dealers cannot be required to submit their inventories to law enforcement. And ATF gun trace data cannot be shared with or used by any individual or entity outside of law enforcement, not by cities, states, researchers, litigants, or members of the public. Under THART, ATF trace data is inadmissible as a matter of law in any non-ATF civil action, administrative proceeding, or license revocation hearing. These amendments were designed to hobble law enforcement, lawmakers, litigants, and regulators, and to hide the true scope of this epidemic from public view in the service of protecting the gun industry at all costs. And it is not a coincidence that a law intended to shield the gun industry from accountability targets data, because data is the essential ingredient of nearly every gun violence prevention strategy. What data can we get? What data can we use? How can we use it? And perhaps most importantly, do we have the resources to make the most of whatever data we do get?
Could you wrap up, please?
Absolutely. I'll skip ahead. So our office is committed to working with this body to work on any new legislation that you're interested in passing. However, we would suggest a few changes that do not require improving upon our strong statutory framework. We would suggest the immediate enactment of legislation already passed to crack down on ghost guns was passed by this legislature 4 months ago, and we would urge the governor to sign it at the earliest possible moment. We would also urge funding for strategies involving data. We think that in our office, we have the tools to take this epidemic on from all angles. And we have one of the most sophisticated public-facing data analytics platforms in the country that was created in 2016. And we look forward to working with this legislature to ensure that these efforts are properly funded. We also strongly support whatever funding, resources it takes to finally bring the ammunition sale database up online. And we would like to advocate for the large-scale expansion of public health and violence interruption models, which are proven to reduce gun violence without contributing to over-incarceration. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a few questions for each of you. I'll try to limit it. So, DA Soares, what community-based strategies do you think would be most effective to turn people away from purchasing firearms, I guess specifically younger people?
I think any community in the state of New York or anywhere in the country, if you want to know what your community is going to look like with respect to violence and gun activity, inquire as to how much is being invested in 10-year-olds who live in communities where gun violence is being experienced most personally. That will tell you all you need to know of your future. In communities like the 75 blocks in Albany, what we see, and I think what we've historically always experienced, is the fact that here on the law enforcement end, there is a tight network of intelligence gathering that we use for purposes of interdiction, for purposes of prosecution. There are very few bridges that connect that intelligence to those who are providing other services of prevention. And I think that models that should be explored by bodies such as this, which begs for longer conversations, is why aren't we directing the resources that are necessary at families and youth so that with the same sort of intelligence that is being gathered for the purposes of interdiction. Certainly if we're more trauma-informed, if schools are more trauma-informed as to what's happening, because, whatever FBI data you're reading in terms of the shootings demonstrating the increase or the information that I'm showing you here or anywhere else in this state, understand that it's happening in small, concentrated pockets. And those pockets, you have schools there, you have other institutions that are there that families are living in and kids are taking advantage of. There's got to be a way for us to take this data that we're using for purposes of interdiction, sharing it with these other institutions so that they can be trauma-informed and know how to deploy resources.
In another area, has your office prosecuted people for violating the safe storage provisions?
Those cases are very few and far between. And it's not whether the office is prosecuting them, but whether or not those are cases that are being brought by our partners in law enforcement. I have not seen many of those cases, and in addition to that, the cases that I have seen that had very similar fact patterns, they're prosecuted under the endangering statute more than they are the storage statutes.
Okay. To the AG's office, there were ghost guns recovered earlier this year that the AG's investigation, as a result of the AG's investigation and prosecution of 2 major drug networks in central New York. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So, our office is obviously composed of many parts, and that's the Organized Crime Task Force, who do these long-term criminal investigations of major sort of networks of usually gun and drug dealers. I would be happy to get some more information from my colleagues on that front, whatever we can share publicly. But we do think that that sort of work is incredibly important, and we believe that that's a very important place to focus law enforcement resources, is tracking guns at their source and looking into the network, working with other states, working with our partners in law enforcement, federal, state, and local, to ensure that we are stopping guns before they get to the streets. Going for possession charges and focusing on that, we don't believe that is nearly as an effective strategy as these long-term investigations. But on ghost guns in particular, they're designed to evade a gap in federal law, right? As you know, and to be unserialized. So there's no real reason, given how easy it is to purchase a gun, that you need a gun that cannot be serialized. So we feel very strongly about ghost guns and very concerned about their proliferation. And we'd be happy to discuss it more with this body or anyone else interested in working with us.
Okay, thank you. Tom, do you have anything?
Yes. Mr. District Attorney, thank you very much. I'm just intrigued by the suggestion you made about the cooperation between law enforcement and the community agencies. Who makes the determination, or who would make the determination of when you should continue with the prosecution and when you should refer it to a social agency? It would seem to me that that's a difficult decision, and that if it were left to the hands of law enforcement, they would probably continue with the prosecution. While on the other hand, if it were left the decision were with the social service agencies, they would want to intervene right away and solve the problem from the family point of view. How do you put those two conflicting concepts together? Because I like what you're saying. I'm just trying to figure out how do you make it work.
I think, and I apologize if I confused anyone with my remarks. I think what we're all thematically here today suggesting is that there is such great value in data. I wasn't mentioning making the decision or exercising discretion to discontinue a prosecution and make a referral. We do that all the time. We have drug courts. We have a LEAD program here that diverts people even before they're in the system. What I was suggesting, sir, was simply this. Every file in my office, every file, contains an incredible amount of data. When you take a look at collectively what is happening in your community, you see shootings that are taking place on First Street, on 2nd Judson. There's this incredible volume of violence that is taking place in certain pockets of our community. And we use that data for purposes of prosecution, investigation and prosecution. But what I just don't understand how, as a society, as a community, we can ever hope to improve, right? If other institutions that are providing services directly into those neighborhoods, into those communities, do not have the access to the same information so that they're trauma-informed as they begin to deploy, their resources. And what I'm suggesting is that if we ever hope to change things, turn things around, we do have to make greater investments in infrastructure. We do have to have a process in place that looks at this data, that ensures that we're not compromising information or individuals as we share that data. But we should be looking at perhaps some legislation and some policy considerations that would enable those of us who do live in that silo of tremendous data acquisition, figuring out how we can make that data, we can weaponize that data to cure some of the other issues.
Now,
that
you started off by talking about, you said you find a lot of shell casings, et cetera, et cetera. That goes to one of the points that we wanted to cover in the hearing today.
Yes.
About the ammunition database.
Yes.
Do you think that would be helpful to your efforts to trace guns?
The most effective tool right now that I think exists in law enforcement, and by the way, anyone who sits in a chair like this and hope they don't take an oath and attempts to inform a body like this of the volume of guns in their community really isn't being truthful. The reality is that we have no idea how many illegal weapons are floating in the illicit economy in our community. One of the most effective strategies that I've ever seen is the NIBIN program with the ATF. And the ATF, along with the New York Police Department, they have launched a new initiative called the Crime Gun Intelligence Center. And the Crime Gun Intelligence Center, their specific purpose is shell casings, weapons that are retrieved as relate to crime. Those are immediately tested. Now, NIBIN has been around for decades, but the problem has always been the length of time between submitting a shell casing and the amount of time that report generally comes back to you. It could take months, and that does not have any investigatory value. But now they've been able to reduce that time within a week, which promises incredible investigative value. Now with that bit of information, you will know when this gun was born, when this gun, we know by having it, the gun is no longer on the street, but you'll also know.
Yeah, but let me ask you, how do you trace the gun? How do you trace the bullet to the gun without a database?
The database is the NIBIN. The NIBIN is the database. The difference, I think, between the database that you're discussing and the database that is in play that is causing a revolution in our industry is one seeks to track and trace at the beginning, at point of purchase. The other is actually assisting in investigatory lead.
Yeah, but you're only able to get to guns that have been used in a crime before, correct?
Yes.
So if the gun was not used in a crime previously, you can't trace the bullet to the gun?
No.
So that's the purpose of what we're talking about, is we're trying to give you more data so that you can trace every bullet to the gun. You don't have to rely only on the guns that were previously used in a crime.
The guns, the world that we're in is reactionary. The database that provides information and data about people acquiring bullets, I think, would be incredibly vast. And I will never reject, I will never say no to any data. But in terms of
You're basically going to the question, is it practical, is basically what you're saying?
It's practical. It has value.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one of the proponents of your testimony also includes a conversation about gun violence as it relates to the elimination of cash bail. And you suggested that we need to allow for more judicial discretion. But it is also documented that many of the judges carry implicit bias, but they also use a number of risk assessment tools that have been found to be inherently racist. Some of these factors that get weighted includes criminal history, mental illness, and substance abuse problems. Just yesterday, we had a forum where we were advised by the Commissioner of Mental Health that Black youth are the most at risk of having unaddressed mental health issues. However, these are some of the factors that gets included with deciding whether or not someone is inherently dangerous. for a dangerousness standard. Some of the other questions includes whether or not the person has housing, whether they are employed, whether they are homeowners, how long were they employed, as well as the level of education, which again tends to carry a certain mischaracterization of people in poverty and people of color. Do you believe that these risk assessment tools or some element of judicial discretion will lead to a discriminatory result if we were to eliminate cash bail completely and only employ judicial discretion based on a dangerousness standard?
What I believe is what I've said consistently since the day the issue came up, which is the state of New York needed bail reform and discovery reform, and it was long overdue. My remarks then, my remarks now, is that 85% of what was done in this body has demonstrated that it was incredibly effective and wonderful, and I embrace it, and I employ it. What I said was, the remaining 15% is where we're going to see all of the problems. According to OCA, who published a report earlier on in the year that took all those numbers into effect, their numbers bared out exactly what I said, which was that 85% of the people charged with offenses were released. It was the 15%, cut down further, 7.5%, that repeated offenses. I'm not here to quarrel about mental health. We know that these issues exist. We know that. Housing. We know that the communities that I defend and that I cherish are very complicated, and I consider them very vulnerable because they're battling things within the community that no other community has to experience. My only issue is this. I had, just weekend, I had a shootout in my community, a mass shootout, right? There were 10 people that were arrested as a result of that shootout. By the time the 5th person was arraigned for that shooting, the 2nd person had already been made bail and went out on the street. And that's my problem. My problem is that I think you're absolutely right. I think this body was right. Look, if you allow for general discretion, you're going to have bias that seeps in some way, shape, or form. We're all humans, and that's going to happen. But there are ways of being able to create safeguards so that those who have demonstrated, their inability to maintain themselves or to conduct themselves in an orderly way that are posing a threat to public safety, there's got to be a way for us to be able to say, yes, this is different. And I believe that the creativity and the knowledge that exists within the various professions that could come together, I think something can be tailored to address those concerns. It is impossible for me to believe that New York, out of all the states that got rid of cash bail, that New York stands alone in not having some kind of tool that would enable a judge to consider public safety in making a decision.
But doesn't that tool exist already? These risk assessment tools have been employed throughout courts in New York State as long as I can remember, and I'm sure since long before then as well.
When you say these tools?
Risk assessment tools, where you're asked questions and you're given a score as to whether or not you can be released or detained. Haven't those tools been used in the state of New York to determine?
I certainly cannot speak to the ecology of New York City, the criminal justice ecology there.
New York State.
It's a different world. It's certainly not a tool that is used by our judges, defense practitioners, or prosecutors in upstate New York.
Thank you.
And I just want to say, I hear your words. And I feel, the concerns that you articulate. But we have to find some balance, because what is happening right now, and I'm just communicating this to you, What is happening right now is we have young people who have never committed crimes, 22, 23 years old. These are kids that are living in the most dangerous communities. They've never committed a crime. And now we are making arrests for criminal possession of weapons because they feel that they need to protect themselves, and it's a less of a risk of them getting apprehended by us than being caught empty-handed on the street. And I'm not saying that for purposes of making any political points. I'm not. But I'm saying that our community is changing. And I want to be able to get to the table and find some solution to what I see.
But I believe that it is still possible to conduct a sensitive balancing test, considering it has been documented as well that maybe there's less than 0.5% of the people actually who are out on bail come back and commit another shooting crime. And when we have to weigh that against the injustices that gets created based on an inherent institutional and systematic criminal justice system, which is, has been biased since the beginning of time. And I think that that's the goal, I believe, that we are all trying to do, so that we can have public safety, but we can also ensure that our rights are not being violated as well. Thank you.
I don't disagree with you, but that OCA number, as I said before, is 7.5%. And the problem with that number is that it's only one community, and it's a small community that is having to endure the consequences of that 7.5%.
We have to move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to be very brief. D. Suarez, thank you for coming today. I don't know if you would know the answer to this, but I asked that also to the police witnesses that were before you. From the amount of guns recovered by the police department and as well as being prosecuted by your office, can you give us some kind of indication, percentage-wise, how many of them were out-of-state guns, potentially stolen out-of-state, brought to New York, or guns actually legally, at one point legally registered in New York State?
I can say that the vast majority of weapons that we have involved in our cases are not guns that were lawfully purchased. How many are traveling from other states? I couldn't tell you that unless we did a post-analysis to determine, where they're coming from. But most police departments and most prosecutors are so inundated with cases now that literally we are dealing with a matter in front of us. One of the reasons I continue to harp on the crime gun intelligence centers that the ATF and the NYPD has created is because if we invest in this infrastructure of these intelligence centers, we will be able to provide you as a region, that exact information. And I think that in order for us to be able to fend off the current threat of illegal guns on the street, as well as the impending threat of ghost guns that are coming to our mailboxes, we have to do this now. We really have to engage in this practice now.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Next is Rebecca Chevalier, Staff Attorney, Legal Aid Society. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to testify this afternoon. My name is Rebecca Chevalier. I am a staff attorney in the Community Justice Unit at the Legal Aid Society. Not only have I been an attorney at the Legal Aid Society for 14 years, I've resided within the confines of the 40th Precinct in the Bronx, in the South Bronx, for over 15 years. Therefore, not only has this been my life work, it has also been my lived experience. I don't want to use my limited, valuable time addressing the lies spewed by Commissioner Shea and the district attorneys in the effort to draw a false connection between gun violence and bail reform. Assemblymember Walker already mentioned the false accusation of a legal aid client for a crime that he could not have committed. As part of the commissioner's unscrupulous campaign against bail reform, our client's name and photo was distributed to the media as an assailant, and Commissioner Shea was right there proclaiming without evidence that the assault was a result of bail reform. Commissioner Shea and the district attorneys are threatened by the reality that we cannot arrest and prosecute our way out of gun violence. So they have no choice but to distract you with bail reform. Acknowledging otherwise means admitting that policing is not the solution. New York City's recent spike in shooting and murder is a tragic development, but available data contradict the notion that bail reform is at all linked to the increase, much less a major driver of it. Bail reform has had no effect on rearrest rates for people charged with violent felonies. And also to address the dangerousness. Dangerousness standard is not radical, it is racist. Data shows over-policing results in the majority of people being arrested being black and brown people. This would imply that black and brown people are dangerous, and that is not what this assembly body wants to promote. Truth is, we need you, our leaders, pursuing effective, evidence-based solutions outside of our criminal legal system, and that is why I'm here to talk to you today. So what is the Community Justice Unit, and what do we do? In 2012, New York City undertook an innovative approach to reduce violence by implementing the Cure Violence Model Program to interrupt and reduce violence in impacted communities. There are currently 18 programs operating 22 sites in the 5 boroughs in the city. We provide legal services to those Cure Violence programs. This model was created by Dr. Slucken out of Chicago. It's a public health approach to reduce violence by entrusting the community to heal itself through engagement and outreach rather than relying on policing. Treat violence as we would a disease. It aims to stop the spread of violence in the community by using methods and strategies associated with public health and disease control. So we're detecting and interrupting potential violent conflicts. We are identifying and treating people at the highest risk of getting caught in gun violence, and we are changing the social norms in those communities, thereby stopping violence at its source. The comprehensive Cure Violence model in New York City employs a team of credible messengers, and these are the people who have the respect of the community and possess street credibility to influence and change behavior to implement this 3-pronged approach. Violence interrupters, outreach workers, and hospital responders engage the highest risk individuals in the catchment area, and that is the geographical perimeter that the programs operate in. Violence interrupters are detecting and interrupting potential conflicts involving the highest risk individuals by walking the catchment area, and that also includes the virtual catchment area because we know a lot of things happen online. They're speaking to community members, they're engaging directly with high-risk individuals, and when there are acts of violence, they utilize intervention and mediation skills to reduce the likelihood of retaliation. Hospitals responders stationed at New York City trauma centers respond to victims being treated for stabbing and shootings. They also employ mediation and intervention skills to prevent retaliation while also offering social services to the person and their family members. Outreach workers build relationships, they keep the participants engaged in positive social norms, they connect them with comprehensive social services through the wraparound service providers. And this fosters long-term behavioral changes leading to better decision-making. Wraparound services range from therapeutic services to mediation to job readiness and vocational services. And unique to the New York City model, legal wraparound services. In 2012, the City Council tasked to prevent gun violence discovered the targeted group and their families were often facing a variety of legal problems. It concluded, in order to effectively interrupt violence and change the norms of the community, legal services would be necessary to assist program participants in resolving these issues. We provide these direct services to the participants, staff members, and committee members in the area of law, from expunging criminal histories to resolving child custody matters, and from supporting housing rights to helping navigate the immigration system. In addition to direct legal services, we conduct Know Your Rights training and partner in community-based events throughout the city. Cure violence programs work. John Jay's College's numerous research data support that. Specifically, the 2013 independent study of two New York City cure violence sites saw a 20% reduction in shootings and positive changes in social norms. It concluded, when compared with similar areas of New York City, gun violence rates declined significantly in the two neighborhoods operating programs inspired by the cure violence the cure violence model. In John Jay's 2015 evaluation, they saw an 18% reduction in killings. The second evaluation conducted in 2018 for the two program sites in Brooklyn and the Bronx. In Brooklyn, there was a 63% reduction in killings, and in the Bronx, there was a 50% reduction in gun injuries.
Could you wrap up, please?
Yes, I'm definitely.
Thank you.
What we know is that this is a complex, multi-layered issue. It's generational trauma and harm inflicted in our community. There is no quick approach to resolve these issues in our community. Policing attempts to address the end result, not the root cause. Commissioner Shea pointed out one young man had 83 arrests, but no one said why or even bothered to attempt to address why. It is easy to throw those stats out and not discuss the why. But what we do know that pretrial incarceration disrupts lives and leads to more incarceration. Research indicates that the overuse of jails can lead to more criminal activity and risk undermining the health of individuals, families, and entire neighborhood. So what do we need? Resource and time. The best approach to reduce gun violence is to further invest in cure violence program and other social services that in these impacted communities. It means a commitment to properly fund cure violence sites, ensuring that they're running at optimal level. It means increasing the number of sites to better service New York residents. 22 sites for a city of 8 million who need services now more than ever is insufficient. It means increasing other social services in our impacted community to ensure the core issues inflicting the harm that leads to violence will be addressed. It means investing in improving education and vocational services. There also needs to be an investment of time. The ailments in our communities did not occur overnight and can't and won't be resolved quickly. Invest the time to allow programs to have meaningful impact. Earlier, we discussed the dramatic impact cure violence programs have had in their community. That is with only 22 sites operating within the past 10 years. Imagine what can be accomplished with 50 or 100 sites, city and statewide, in the next 10 years. We've been conditioned to believe that the only way to address problems in our community is through policing and incarceration. We've used that approach for over 100 years. We must unlearn the knee-jerk reaction of over-reliance on policing to solve problems in our community. It is time to fully invest in this innovative approach that the data support. This is a public health issue, not a criminal justice issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Latrice, you have anything?
Yes. I would I guess just first comment by saying it's a pleasure to meet you. And I couldn't have said it better myself. And so I appreciate hearing your testimony today. I would like to know, though, has a copy of your testimony been provided to the committee?
Not at this moment, but it will be provided before the 28th.
Okay. Please do so. And also to just submit that I do agree that our cure violence organizations need to be invested in a lot more. And particularly, one of the things that we've noticed with the NYPD through the Brownsville Safety Alliance, that it can work also when we employ our policing tactics, precision policing tactics, and cure violence tactics, and community working together in order to address this scenario. So again, we don't have to compromise one for the other. But we noticed too, though, is that crime is a 24-hour clock. And many of our cure violence organizations have a 9-to-5 budget. And so we do, and I appreciate you advocating for more resources in that particular area. So thank you for your testimony today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming here today.
Thank you.
I know that when you spoke earlier, you recognized the fact that there is an increase in crime in New York City and New York State. Is that correct?
Yes.
But I know that you took issue with Commissioner Shea's interpretation of why we have that increase. What is your opinion as to the reason we have that increase in crime?
I think, so Commissioner Shea and most of the district attorneys and police officers here have been focusing on data for the past 2 years. And the past 2 years, we've been in the middle of a pandemic. That's going to cause an increase in a lot of things. It's data usually show when there is economic strife, there's going to potentially be increase in crimes. Why? Because social services, people are desperate. They're looking at job insecurity. They're looking at food insecurity. They're looking at housing insecurities. Along with the pandemic, we had a lot of people being transitioned to a whole new type of way of operating virtually. And what that does with the disconnect of direct human contact. So there's a lot of reasons why that there may be that increase. But I don't believe that policing is going to address that. It's the social services. Every data is showing that the issues we are facing are relating to social issues, social problems, decrease. Even with the Cure Violence program, this is a type of program that is most effective when our violence interrupters are walking the catchment area at 1 o'clock in the morning. At one point, they had to basically transition to doing a lot of their work virtually. And I think now that they're returning to being back on the street and being able to do hands-on work, we'll see that there's an improvement of what's going on in the communities. Similarly, where once social service programs are back up and running, such as during the pandemic, a lot of the drug programming that service our community were shuttered, or they had reduced access. So you had people who are not getting the access to their mental health treatment and services the way they would. There may be methadone treatment as they would. And those decrease in services, as well as the fact that a lot of people lost their jobs. So now there is housing insecurity, there's food insecurity. So a lot of these young people that we're referring to and calling them criminals, which they are not, are facing those challenges. So we have to address the actual core issue. Policing addresses the end result and never addresses the core problem that leads to people to engage in certain behaviors. And I think that is what needs to be the focus.
Thank you. And just one last question. Last week I visited Rikers Island with some colleagues, and we saw terrible, I can't even describe what I observed for both the inmates and the corrections officers. What do you think should happen with Rikers Island?
It should be shut down.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next and last is Jake McGuigan, National Shooting Sports Foundation.
That's a foundation.
Barely.
I have a headset, so I thought that was going to help, but I will try to speak up and speak clearly.
Thank you.
My name is Jake McGuigan. I'm Managing Director of State Affairs for the National Shooting Sports Foundation. We are the trade association for the firearms industry. We represent manufacturers, retailers, ranges, and sportsmen's clubs around the country, and over 2,000 FFLs in New York State. I sat through the testimony today, and I want to have an open discussion with the chair and with members of the committee about the database. I'll be open to questions at the end of it about what I've seen around the country and what this could happen or happen in New York State. But I wanted to focus first on the fact that since January of 2020, we have 11.6 million new gun owners in this country. We're seeing a change in the demographics. Of those, about 40% are females. We see an increase in purchases in both urban areas, and we've seen an 86% increase in the Black community purchasing firearms and an 83% increase in the Hispanic population. These are lawful purchases by people lawfully obtaining a firearm through a retailer. Obviously, the last thing that the industry wants is for a prohibited person to gain access to firearms. And that's what we're here today, I believe, to have a discussion about and how can we stop this from happening. But as Chair Dinowitz said, he wants to focus on data. So if we take a look at the ATF tracing data, which is readily available, New York State, the time to crime for a firearm is close to 12 years. It's actually 11.75 years. So what does that mean? That means for a gun to be used in a crime, it's close to 12 years old. The national average is around 8 years. So if we looked at traced firearms in New York State, in 2019, 7,363 guns were traced. Of those, close to 50% of them were in New York City. And the number one source for crime guns in New York State is, in fact, New York State. Many of the groups that look at gun laws or in states, the Gifford Center and the Brady Center both look at New York State and rate it as A-rated. So what more can be done on your side to increase an A rating? I think this discussion needs to be shifted towards the individual, not the instrument, and not technology that is not going to do anything except cost the taxpayers money. Simple analysis. In 2020, based on newly released FBI statistics, 657 people in the United States were killed with long guns, yet 1,732 were killed with knives. So are we focusing on the instrument? Are we focusing on a technology that won't work? Or are we focusing, on the problem at hand? What I do want to point out is New York State did have COBIS. COBIS was a ballistics imaging database where every round from a firearm that was sold at retail was included in that database. That database disappeared in 2012. It was repealed because it did not solve a single crime. It was costing taxpayers millions of dollars to move and put casings in there that were not showing up at crime scenes. So why would we be going back to a system that didn't work and implement it for ammunition, which will be even more extensive and not have any public safety benefit? As the district attorney, Albany district attorney mentioned, the technology is there. There's no need for an ammunition database. There's no need for a firearm database. The database is there with the ATF. They have crime guns in that system. NIBIN is a system that NSSF supports and believes that you should be using. And he did make mention that you should be investing in those systems, not in a database that's going to basically produce zero results. What I like to, and I'm going to go real quick. I know some discussion has been made about microstamping, and this wasn't originally on my list, but in New York State, they would only be the second state in the country to look at microstamping. Microstamping is essentially a sole-sourced, patented technology that does not work. Allegedly, it's supposed to put the model, make, and serial number on a bullet casing, and then in theory, when you're at the crime scene, you're going to pick up the bullet casing and find out, who committed the crime. We all know that the majority of firearms are stolen firearms, so it's not going to give you a lead. There is already the ATF database in place that is much easier and will be much more usable than microstamping. Again, NSSF has consistently supported further research of the technology, along with the National Fraternal Order of Police, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the National Research Council, because it's not ready for prime time, it does not work, and it can be easily defeated. I'm going to jump real quick to the ammunition database, which what this hearing was about. I believe that the ammunition database is being trumpeted as a solution to this gun violence problem, and it's not. You're basically going to be putting in information of legal gun owners when they purchase ammunition and expect that to produce a result and solve crimes. The COBIS system in New York State did not do it when you had firearms, and it will not do anything when you have ammunition purchases as well. But if we're talking about background checks, again, that would not solve a crime issue. A simple situation is during the Obama administration, Assistant Secretary to the State, Thomas Countryman, fought ammunition registration and fought background checks, simply saying that regulating domestic transfers has shown little utility for law enforcement in imposing the same controls on that ammunition as we do for firearms. Again, if you look back in history, the Gun Control Act was amended in the mid-1980s to remove records of ammunition sales and essentially a database. They said and testified in front of Congress that the sales logs were not an effective law enforcement tool, and they did not oppose removing those onerous regulations. So again, I want to leave time for questions. I don't want to continue to go on. I did send in my written testimony this morning that you can take a look at. But again, I want investments and resources to be put into the systems that we know work. The woman from the Legal Aid Society did point out that community justice programs and those programs within the community need the resources. I don't think New York State wants to go down the road of spending hundreds of millions of dollars to develop a database to track ammunition sales that will be zero benefit to public safety. Again, this goes back to Governor Cuomo and the situation where he implemented it and then realized that it's basically unattainable. It can be built, but that money can be used for much better solutions, and putting it into a database is not going to be the answer. So I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate the chair allowing me to speak, and I appreciate the invite and for doing it virtually today. I would be happy to take any questions concerning microstamping, which I have fought and dealt with across this country, including in California, which is the only state to implement microstamping. And not a single firearm has been microstamped in California. So thank you, sir.
Do you have any questions? Nobody has questions. Thank you very much for your testimony. Have a good day. That was the last witness, so we are going to close the hearing. I thank everybody who participated. There was some very valuable testimony given, and we appreciate it. Have a good afternoon.